She was 99 and homeless. No bedroom, no coat, no address. Just a flour sack bag and $11 she had kept folded inside envelope from a grocery job that had ended before winter came. And with that $11, she bought a Tollhouse for $5 along an abandoned turnpike in Cumberland County, Pennsylvania, near Carlisle, in 1978, after the road had fallen off county map. The roof sagged where rain had found the rafters. One back wall had split from frost and neglect. The county had condemned it since 9969 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that inside the bricked-up toll vault behind the original iron cashier's window, in a sealed compartment that had not been opened in over 50 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Miriam Elise Krause had been leaving her whole life without knowing it. She first learned the habit in narrow rooms where adults lowered their voices when bills arrived, and where every chair seemed borrowed from someone kinder. Her child had no one true address, only a sequence of houses with rented porches, slanting floors, and kitchen drawers that never held the same spoons for more than a year. She knew how to fold a dress so it would not wrinkle inside a sack. She knew how to listen at a doorway before stepping through. She knew which floorboards complained, which cupboards stuck, which women in church basements saved bread heels in paper bags after funeral suppers. There were seasons when her shoes fit, and seasons when they did not. In summer, she walked along these barefoot to spare the soles. In winter, she lined them with newspaper from the Harrisburg Patriot, smoothing the pages with exact care before pressing her feet into cold leather. Her hands became patient early. They mended what tore. They washed what could still be worn. They held on. Her mother had once been pretty in a way that made strangers kind for a minute. She wore her hair pinned tight and kept a bottle of drugstore perfume for Sundays, though most Sundays she did not attend anywhere. She had a soft voice that could make apology sound like weather, something passing over a roof that nobody controlled. When Miriam was young, that voice had sung to her over dishwater. Not whole songs, only fragment remembered from a girlhood farm near Boiling Springs. Later, after years of boarding rooms and unpaid rent, the singing stopped. Her mother came careful with silence. Her father remained mostly a photograph. He had been a mechanic who smelled of gasoline, cut grass, and iron filings. Miriam remembered the weight of his hand on the back of her coat when crossing streets, and the way he could lift a watch to his ear and tell whether it was worth saving. He died before memory could become conversation. Pneumonia took him in a winter that froze cistern pumps and left laundry stiff as boards. Afterward, tools disappeared one by one into pawn shops. Each sale described as temporary until temporary became the family language. The person refused to let Miriam vanish completely was Großmutter Hannelore Krause. She was not a grandma in the easy picture book sense. She was a narrow-backed woman born in 998, with silver hair coiled at the nape of her neck and hands marked by lye, winter cracks, and permanent stains of blue and red pigment beneath the nails. She lived in a modest farm outside Newville, in a place where the lay long and open, and where the wind moved across corn stubble with the sound of dry paper. Her English was exact. Her Pennsylvania German reserved for prayer, scolding, and songs older than anyone left alive to explain them. Every other Saturday, when bus fare could be spared, Miriam went to her. Those weekends had a ritual as deliberate as church. First came bread toasted on the stove until one side smoked. Then came coffee, the elder woman, and milk for the girl, poured into thick cups with hairline crack. After breakfast, Hannah cleared the table, spread a piece of clean muslin over the boards, and brought out the painted wooden box from the cupboard above the stove. Inside lay the remains of an art Miriam did not yet understand how much she needed. There were quills trimmed fine, brushes wrapped in cotton, cakes of dry pigment in oyster shell, and small sheets of paper pressed beneath a Bible to keep them flat. Hannah called the work fractor, though she said the word gently, as if it were a name belonging to someone asleep. She showed Miriam how a tulle not simply a tulip, but a vow made visible. A bird could carry blessing. A heart might mean devotion, or grief, or a place where both had learned to sit together. Letters were drawn first as bone, then given skin, then clothed in colour. The elder woman never praised quickly. Praise, she believed, made the hand lazy if given before the hand had learned discipline. She corrected Miriam by placing one finger beside the line, not on it, never smearing wet colour. Again, she would say, slower, or the brush knows when you hurry. Sometimes she said nothing at all, and the silence was more useful than speech. Miriam loved the preparation almost as much as the painting. Hannah warmed a little gum arabic near the stove and mixed pigment with water until it shone like damp earth. She ground yellow from ochre, red from madder, black from lamp soot kept in a screw-up jar. There were no wasted movements. Even rinsing a brush had ceremony. Swirl, press, turn, lay flat. Never leave the bristles standing in water. Never drag a line you could guide. In late afternoons, when light lowered across the kitchen window, Hannah would let Miriam copy old birth certificates from Lancaster County families whose names bent across the paper in formal brack script. Some had angels. Some had vines. Some had dates from a century before, still bright because they had been kept away from damp and careless fingers. The girl copied the curves until her wrist ached. One November day, when Miriam had ruined 3 borders in a row, she pushed the paper away and stared at the stove. Hannah did not scold. She lifted the wet sheet, studied the crooked flowers, and set it near the warming shelf. Then she said the sentence Miriam would carry longer than any object. A hand is steadied by what refuses to throw away. At the time, Miriam believed the words meant ruined paper, blunt brushes, and practice sheets. Years later, when nearly everything else had been taken or sold or left behind, she would understand that Hannah had been speaking of people too. A life could be steadied by what refused to discard inside self. Skill, memory, a name spoken correctly, a road home, even when the house at the end of it was gone. Hannah died in March, under a sculler of dishwater. There was no grand bed, no gathering of cousins, no family Bible opened with solemn hands. She died in a county hospital room where the radiator knocked through the night and a nurse had taped one corner of the window against a draught. Miriam sat beside her through the last afternoon, holding a cup of melting ice chips that were no longer needed. The elder woman's hands, once so exact, lay open on the blanket. A faint trace of blue remained beside one thumbnail. After the funeral, the farmhouse was cleared by relatives who arrived with pickup trucks and practical mouths. They spoke of mildew, taxes, auction value. Miriam looked for the painted wooden box and did not find it. The cupboard above the stove was empty. The Bible was gone. So were the old papers, the oyster shells, the trimmed quills, the brushes wrapped in cotton. Someone said those things were probably discarded because they were of no use to anyone. Miriam did not answer. She walked by the house to the edge of the field and stood where thawing mud swallowed the heels of her shoes. Crows worked the far fence line. In the grass near the chopping block, she found one scrap of stained muslin caught beneath a splinter, stiff with old pigment and weather. She folded it twice and put it in her pocket. It was not enough. It was what remained. By autumn, she was living in her aunt's boarding house in Harrisburg, in a room that once held trunks and paint cans. The ceiling sloped so low near the window that she had to bend when making the bed. The aunt, her mother's sister, had taken her in with the weary generosity of a woman who wanted credit for kindness but not the daily cost of it. There was always soup, but never quite enough meat in it. There was always a place at the table, but Miriam learned to sit at the corner where her elbows would not be noticed. The house changed when the aunt remarried. The new husband arrived with polished shoes, a felt hat, and the smell of aftershave that filled the hallway before he entered a room. He was not loud. That was almost worse. Loud men revealed where their anger stood. This one kept his displeasure in folded napkins, locked drawers, measured glance at the sugar bowl, and a pencil he used each night to mark columns in a household ledger. He believed in order, by which he meant fewer bodies depend on his wages. He called him practical. He called other people burdens. He never struck Miriam. He did not need to. He moved her chair from the table to the wall when guests came. He stacked her mail beside the coal scuttle. He referred to her in the third person while she stood within hearing. The girl. The extra one. Your niece. Every object she owned seemed to come evidence against her. A second towel. A chipped mug. A pair of stockings drying near the stove. Her aunt began apologizing with her hands instead of words, touching the edge of the tablecloth, straightening curtains, smoothing the front of her dress until the fabric shone. Miriam worked where she could. She washed dishes in a diner with steam-clouded windows. She swept hair at a beauty shop after closing. She carried groceries for widows who counted pennies into her palm and apologized for the smallness of the amount. At night, she copied fractal letters on brown wrapping paper because proper paper cost money, and because the movement kept her from hearing too much through the walls. The eviction came after supper on a Thursday. There had been cabbage, boiled potatoes, and a slice of ham cut so thin it curled at the edges. Rain tapped the back porch roof, patient and cold. Miriam had just washed the plates and set them in the rack when her aunt's husband entered the kitchen carrying her flour sack bag. He had packed it badly. One sleeve her dress hung from the top, and the lit scrap of Hannelaw's muslin lay folded in the outer seam where she always kept it. He placed the bag on the chair. There is no room for extra mouths. 8 words. No anger in them. No raised voice. That made them colder. Miriam looked at her aunt first. Not at him. The woman stood by the stove with both hands wrapped around a dish towel. Her eyes had settled somewhere near the floorboards between them. She did not nod. She did not plead. She did not say the girl had nowhere to go. She only twisted the towel once, slowly, until the cotton tightened like a rope. That was the betrayal. Not cruelty. Not speech. The absence of a hand reaching out. Miriam dried her palms on her skirt, took the flour sack bag, and checked the envelope by touch. $11. A comb. 1 dress. 2 pairs of stockings. the muslin scrap, a pencil stub, a folded sheet of brown paper covered in half-finished tulips. She did not ask for more time. She did not say goodbye in a way that could be refused. At the door, her aunt moved one step forward, then stopped. Rain had gathered in the broken lip of the porch gutter and fell in a single steady rope beside the steps. Miriam walked through it and felt the cold water strike her shoulder. Behind her, the door closed with careful softness, as if someone inside did not wish to wake a sleeping house. For 6 weeks, she learned the geography of being unwanted. In Harrisburg, she slept 2 nights beneath the stone arch near the railroad bridge, where freight cars moved through darkness with iron patience. She kept her bag beneath her head and woke each time footsteps passed. By morning, her coat smelled of river damp and coal dust. She bought a day, old roll for 7 cents, and stood outside a diner long enough to feel heat from the door whenever a customer entered. On the 3rd day, she walked to Mechanicsburg because someone at the labor office said a laundry needed help. The job had already been taken. She spent that night in the back pew of a Methodist church after a choir rehearsal, sitting upright with her chin against her chest until the janitor found her at dawn. He did not call police. He gave her a pay cup of coffee and a heel of raisin bread wrapped in a napkin. She remembered his hands, the way they shook slightly when he locked the side door behind her. Her money diminished with the exactness of winter light. $11 became $9.83, then $7.41. Bus fare took pieces. Food took smaller pieces more often. A laundromat took quarters she hated surrendering, though she knew clean clothes gave a person one more day of being mistaken for safe. In Carlisle, she slept in a hay barn off the edge of a farm road, burrowing between square bales while mice clicked invisibly in the walls. The farmer's dog found her before the farmer did, a brown hound with a grey muzzle and more curiosity than judgment. When the man opened the barn door, Miriam stood with hay in her hair and both hands visible. He looked at her shoes, then at the sky, then told her she could finish sleeping until sunup if she did not smoke. She thanked him with the formal voice Hannah had taught her. In Shippensburg, she washed in the cold sink of a bus station restroom and used her fingers to comb her hair flat. A woman with a red handbag watched her in the mirror, then left a wrapped egg salad sandwich on the windowsill without a word. Miriam waited until the woman had gone before touching it. Pride had become a luxury, and hunger was exact. There were nights when she walked simply to keep from freezing. Roads that seemed short by daylight stretched into long black ribbons beneath telephone wires. She learned which service stations closed late, which libraries opened early, which clerks looked away if a girl sat too long near the radiator pretending to read. The public library became the safest room in any town. Nobody questioned a person for being still among books. It was in the Bosler Free Library in Carlisle that she found the advertisement. The day had begun with sleep. Her shoes were wet through, and one stocking had torn at the heel. She entered the library short after opening, carrying her sack bag as if it were ordinary, as if every young woman brought all she owned to the reading room. The librarian glanced at her once and then returned to stamping cards. Mercy, Miriam had learned, often looked like not staring. She chose a chair near the radiator and spread the local paper across the table. She was not looking for property. She was looking for work. Mostly kitchen work. Laundry work. Any listing that included room and board. Her eye moved down columns of print, farmhand wanted, typist needed, used stove, estate sale, church supper, county surplus notice. Then she saw it. Abandoned Pike Tollhouse. Count in surplus. $5. Bias for removal or repair. Constructure condemned. Inquire clerk's office. The words were plain enough to be mistaken for nothing. She read them once. Then again, pressing one finger beneath each line. $5. Less than a week of poor meals. Less than a coat. Less than the amount some women spent having their hair set before Sunday. The notice had been printed among haunted machinery and scrap lumber, as if the building were already halfway to being debris. Miriam folded the paper back along its crease, then opened it again. A tollhouse. A place made for watching roads. A place where coins had once passed from hand to hand. A place no one wanted because the road itself had been forgotten. The radiator hissed beside her. Outside, sleet silvered the library steps. She counted her money beneath the table, shielding the bills with her palm. $6.12 remained. Her fingers moved over the edges slowly, not because the amount might change, but because touching each bill made the decision more honest. $5 would leave $1.12. Enough for nothing sensible. Enough for one more day. Perhaps two if she accepted hunger as a room she already knew. She copied the address of the clerk's office onto the back of a church bulletin she had found in the vestibule the night before. Her pencil point broke on the last digit. She sharpened it with a pocket knife borrowed from the librarian, catching the shavings in her palm and dropping them into the wastebasket. A sensible person would have kept walking. Miriam had been sensible 6 weeks. Sensible had given her bridges, barns, public sinks, and the habit of sleeping with one hand wrapped through the strap of her bag. Sensible had not given her a door. She returned the newspaper to its wooden rod and stood. Her knees had stiffened from the radiator heat. At the entrance, she paused beneath the library's high windows and looked back at the reading room, at the table polished by generations of elbows, at the shelves holding leaves that had survived by being bound and kept. Then she stepped in the sleet. The clerk's office was 12 blocks away. Her shoes made dark marks on the pavement as she walked, and each step seemed to spend part of the dollar she had not yet surrendered. By the time she reached the courthouse square, the sleet had turned to rain, and the lime-stained buildings of Carlisle looked washed and stern beneath the winter sky. She stood across the street from the county offices for several minutes, watching people enter with umbrellas, folders, errands, names that belonged somewhere. In her coat pocket, her hand closed around the scrap of stained muslin until the folded cloth warmed against her skin. She did not know then about the iron cashier's window. She did not know about the bricked-up toll vault behind it, or the cherry wood brush handles sealed in darkness, or the bolts of linen wrapped against damp, or the tin canister waiting with a letter inside. She only knew that $5 might buy a ruin, and that a ruin, if it had walls, might keep off rain. So Miriam crossed the street, climbed the courthouse steps, and placed one hand on the brass door pull. The courthouse door gave inward with a brass complaint, and warm air smelling of wet wool, floor wax, and paper dust moved across Miriam's face. Inside, the corridors were wider than they needed to be, with high ceilings that held the morning's footsteps long after the people had passed. Men in overcoats carried folders on their arm. A woman in a green rain bonnet stood at a counter arguing softly about tax stamp. Somewhere beyond a half-open door, a typewriter struck one careful line after another, each key land like a bead dropped into tin dish. Miriam wiped her shoes on the black rubber mat until the soles no longer squeaked. She did not want to leave tracks. Sackbag hung from her left hand, damp at the seams, its patched corner darkened by rain. A directory board stood near the stairwell with white letters pressed into black felt. Recorder of deeds. Treasurer. Probate. Count commissioners. Clerk. She read the word twice before climbing. The clerk's office occupied a room with tall windows looking toward the square, though the glass had gone pale with weather and old cleaning marks. Wooden filing cabinets lined the walls from floor to nearly ceiling, each drawer marked by a small metal frame and a typed label. A calendar from a feed company hung behind the counter, still turned to November, though the month had already tinned toward its end. Beside it sat a brass stamp, a blotter, 2 sharpened pencils, and a ceramic dish filled with paper clips bent by many hands. The woman behind the counter looked up. She was built squarely, with strong wrists, iron grey hair pinned close, and eyeglasses hanging from a chain of small black beads. Her dress was navy wool, plain at the collar, and a cardigan lay fold over the back of her chair. On the desk before her, a nameplate Mereth. Eleanor V. Brindle in black letters on cloudy plastic. She gave Miriam the kind look county clerks gave to strangers who might need more than one form. Yes. Miriam unfolded the clipping, smoothed it with both palms, and placed it on the counter. I came about the Tollhouse. Mrs. Brindle did not touch the paper at first. Her eyes from the notice to Miriam's bag, then to wet cuffs of her coat, then back to the notice. The office seemed to settle around them. The typewriter in the next room stopped. That structure, the clerk said, is not a house in the way most people use the word. Yes. Mum. It has no running water. Yes. Mum. No electricity. Yes. Ma'am. No septic. The old privy unsafe unless proven otherwise. Yes. Ma'am. The county takes no responsibility for injury. Collapse. Vermin. Weather damage. Trespass. Theft. Rot. Smoke damage. Broken masonry. Falling slate. Or whatever else that building has collected since decent people stopped using that road. Miriam folded her hands around the strap of the bag. Yes. Ma'am. Mrs. Brindle leaned back in her chair, and the chair gave a narrow wooden creak. You understand that buying it means taking it as it stands? Yes. Ma'am. You understand the county would rather see it gone? Yes. Ma'am. You understand that the demolition order is already in the file? Yes. Mahem. The clerk removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose with 2 fingers. When she replaced them, her expression had not softened, but something in it had become less official. How old are you? Miriam answered. Mrs. Brindle's mouth tightened, not with disapproval exactly, but with arithmetic. Do you have anyone coming with you? No. Ma'am. Any experience repairing buildings? No. Ma'am. Any employment arranged? Not yet. The woman looked toward the windows, where rain continued to drag itself down the glass. Outside, the courthouse square was all grey trunks, wet benches, parked cars, and the slow procession of people keeping their collars up. When she turned back, she took the clipping at last and opened a drawer beside her knee. Sit down, she said. There was one wooden chair against the wall. Miriam sat on its front edge. Not enough to rest, only enough to obey. The office clock measured a minute in small metallic ticks. Mrs. Brindle pulled a 5 from the drawer and untied the cotton tape around it. The folder had browned at the edges. Its label had been typed years earlier, then correct in pencil twice. Turnpike sew. Parcel 4B. Former toll constructor. West of Carlisle. The clerk spread several papers on the desk, a survey map, a condemnation order, a typed notice of surplus sale, and a deed form with blank spaces waiting to become permanent. She worked carefully, not because the property deserved ceremony, but because records did. She dipped her pen into the black inkwell, though 2 ballpoints lay beside it, then wrote the date in firm loop. Name. Miriam gave it. The pen stopped. Mrs. Brindle lifted her head slowly. Krause. Yes. Ma'am. How do you spell it? Miriam spelled it. The clerk set the pen down. For the first time since Miriam entered, the older woman looked at her not as a petitioner, not as a problem, but as a person who had carried a name into a room where it had been waiting for recognition. There was a cross woman our Newville way, she said. Miriam's hand closed once around the bag strap. My mother had some of her work framed, Mrs. Brindle continued. Mirth record. 2 red birds. A tulip border. I was little, but I remember the lettering. Nobody did that kind of work with such a steady line. The room seemed to narrow, not painfully, but with the exactness of a thread passing through a needle's eye. She taught me some, Miriam said. Mrs. Brindle's eyes lowered to the papers. Then she taught you more than some people inherit with a farm. Neither woman spoke for a moment. The clerk resumed writing, but her hand moved less quickly now. She filled in the parcel number, the township line, the boundary description, the sale amount, the buyer's name, and the phrase "A is," where is in capital letters that appeared heavier than the rest. Then she turned the deed around and placed the pen beside it. Sign here. Miriam bent over the counter. The pen was thicker than the pencil stubs she carried, and the nib resisted the paper at first. She wrote her name slowly. The letters looked more formal than she felt, but they held. Mrs. Brindle took the paper, inspected the signature, and pulled the brass stamp toward her. The stamp had a broad handle polished by decades of cloth. She placed the deed beneath it, aligned the corner, and pressed down. The sound was not loud, but it filled the office, a single hard clap of metal and law. There, she said. She reached into a drawer and removed a narrow manila envelope. Into it she placed the deed copy, a carbon of the bill of sale, and a hand-drawn direction sheet she made on county letterhead. Her pencil moved with the confidence of someone who had known roads before they were improved. You can get a bus as far as the square in Mount Holly Springs, she said. From there you will walk north along Baltimore Avenue. Then turn where it becomes Pine Road. You will pass the old feed mill, a stone culvert, and a white farmhouse with green shutters. Do not take the newer paved spur. It will carry you away from the ridge. Keep to the older track where the walnuts start. If you see a red mailbox shaped like a barn, you have gone too far. Miriam listened as if each landmark were a nail driven into board. How far from the bus? Near 5 miles. More if you miss the turn. Yes. Mum. Mrs. Brindle folded the directions and slid them into the envelope. Then, after a pause, she took a small brass key from a drawer divided into narrow compartments. It was not the tarnished key that would matter later. This one was plain, with a paper tag bound around the string. Front door, if the lock still works. If it does not, the county is not sending a man. I understand. The clerk pushed the envelope across the counter, but did not immediately release her fingers from it. Listen to me, she said. You keep that paper dry. You keep your name on it. There are men who will see a girl alone in a broken building and decide she does not own what she owns. If anyone asks, you tell them the deed is recorded under my hand, and they can come argue with me before they bother you. Miriam nodded once. Mrs. Brindle let go of the envelope. At the door, Miriam turned back. The clerk had already opened another file, but she was not reading it. Thank you, Miriam said. The older woman reached for her glasses chain and gave the faintest nod. Do not thank me yet. Make it stand first. The bus to Mount Holly Springs smelled of damp coats, diesel, tobacco, and the faint sourness of lunch pails emptied hours before. Miriam sat near the rear wheel with the deed envelope inside her coat, flat against her ribs. Each time the bus turned, the paper edge pressed lightly into her side, remind her that something legal and fragile had entered her keeping. The driver was a long-faced man with reddened eyelids and a thermos rolling gently beside his seat. He called out stops without turning his head. Shops, houses, a gas station, a church with a slate roof, all moved by in rain-dark colours. The farther they went from Carlisle, the more the land opened, field cut and brown beneath the low sky. Fence post leaned under old wire. Corn shocks stood in a few forgotten rows like figures waiting to be counted. By the time she stepped down at the square, the rain had slowed to a mist so fine it seemed to hang rather than fall. Mount Holly Springs gathered itself around the road in a modest cluster of daily commerce, Miller's Feed and Grain with its loading dock and dusty windows, a Rexall drugstore whose red sign glowed against the weather, Cora's lunchroom with steam clouding the front glass, a barber shop pole turning faithfully for no visible customer, and Keena's Hardware, its windowed with stovepipe elbow, snow shovels, lamp wicks, and a single red enamel coffee pot. A bell rang somewhere above a shop door. A delivery truck idled near the curb. Two older men in canvas jackets stood beneath the awning of the lunchroom, watching the weather with the seriousness of farmers a year's meaning in the colour of clouds. Miriam did not enter any of the businesses. She stood beneath the Rexall awning and opened Mrs. Brindle's direction sheet. The pencil marks had not smeared. Baltimore Avenue lay ahead, dark with wet leaves along the gutter. She folded the paper again, checked the envelope, shifted the flour sack bag to her other hand, and began walking. The first mile kept company with houses, white porches, coal bins, a chain fence holding 3 bicycles, a woman in an upstairs window shaking dust from a rag. Dogs barked behind storm doors, then lost interest. The road climbed gently, and the town loosened behind her. By the second mile, the air had cooled. The mist became breath. Her wet shoes rubbed the skin above both heels. Cars passed less often, their tyres whispering over the road, throwing a brief dirty spray against the hem of her coat. She walked on the shoulder where gravel shifted underfoot and milkweed pods had split open, spilling silk in the ditch grass. At a bend near the old feed mill, she saw the stone-covered Mrs. Brindle had drawn. Water ran through it in a narrow brown rush, carrying leaves beneath the road. She stopped there and ate half of the bread saved from morning, chewing slowly because chewing slowly gave the body the courtesy of believing there was enough. Beyond the white farmhouse with green shutters, The paved surface narrowed. The newer spur curved away cleanly, with fresh bracktop and a county sign. Miriam looked at it, then at the older track almost hidden beyond a line of walnut trees. The old road seemed less like a road than a remembered habit. Its surface was patched with gravel, clay, and leaf mould. Grass grew in the centre seam. Branches met overhead in places, bare and black against the sky. She chose the walnuts. Evening came early under those trees. The temperature dropped to 36 degrees by the little thermometer outside a farm stand she passed before the land rose again, though the stand itself was closed and its pumpkins had collapsed into orange, frost-softened bowls. Her hand stiffened around the bag handle. Once, near a cattle gate, she stopped to tuck newspaper round her toes inside her shoes, working quickly with fingers that had become clumsy in the cold. She did not reach the Tollhouse before dark. The directions had been honest, but distance in late November had its own arithmetic. A mile with daylight and dry feet was one thing. A mile hungry, wet, and carrying all that remained was another. When the sky closed into blue-black lid and the road ahead disappeared beneath trees, she left the track and moved toward a barn she had seen beyond a low field. The barn leaned but held. Its doors were chained, yet one lower board at the side had warped outward enough for a person to slip through if she was narrow and willing to crawl. Miriam pushed her bag in first, then followed, palm-scraping old splinters. Inside, the dark smelled of hay, dust, dry manure, and the stored breath of animals long gone. She climbed to the loft by a ladder missing its second rung. Above, there were square bales stacked beneath a roof that clicked and settled with the cold. She found a place away from the worst draught and pulled loose hay around her legs. The temperature fell to 31 before midnight. She knew 'cause someone had nailed an old advertising thermometer to a post, and moonlight came through a split in the siding just enough to show the red line. She did not sleep well. Owls called from the woods. Mice moved in the walls. Once, a car passed far off, and its headlight slid through the boards in pale strips, crossing the hay-like water. Miriam kept the deed envelope inside her coat and the plain key tied in the corner of her dress with thread pulled from the flower sack seam. The key was cold the fabric. She was grateful for its weight. Before dawn, she woke with frost on the edge of her sleeve. She climbed down stiffly, brushed hay from her coat, and slipped back through the warped board into fields silvered with cold. The sky in the east had begun to pale. Crows were already awake. She crossed the field, found the old road, and continued north beneath the walnuts. The last mile was the most silent. Houses withdrew. Fences appeared only in fragment. The old turnpike rose and dipped along a low ridge where limestone pushed close to the surface. In places, the original stones still edged the road, half buried beneath moss and winter weed. A dog began barking somewhere unseen, a deep farmyard bark that travelled through bare branches. It followed her for several minutes, then stopped all at once. She passed the red mailbox shaped like a barn and froze. For one sick moment she believed she had gone too far, until she saw, just beyond it, a narrow track bending back beneath two walnut trees grown so close together their branches touched like clasped hands. Mrs. Brindle's pencil map had marked that bend with a plain X. Miriam turned. The Tollhouse appeared gradually, not as a house at first, but as a change in the trees. A low stone well emerged from brush, then a roof line, then a standing stubbornly at one end, its top bricks dark and uneven against the morning. The building sat a little back from the abandoned turnpike, close enough that a driver once could have stopped at the window and paid without stepping down. It was compact, perhaps 20 feet by 28, made of local limestone laid in patient courses, with brick repairs round the front opening and hand-hewn lintels above the door and windows. The roof was slate where it remained and open to the sky where it did not. A narrow porch had collapsed on one side, leaving its post angled into V. Above the front window, a wooden sign hung from one rusted hook. The letters were nearly gone. Only fragment beneath lichen and grey paint pike. Toll. East. The cashier's window faced the road. Its iron bars had rusted but not failed. Behind them, glass was missing from 2 panes, and a third held a crack shaped like lightning. Beneath the window, where countless hands had once passed coins across the sill, the stone was worn smooth in an oval darkened by weather. Beside the door, a small cast-iron plate remained fixed in the wall, its raised letters furred with rust. Turnpike CO 8863. Miriam stood still for a long minute. Not because was beautiful in any easy sense. It was not. It was damp, injured, neglected, and very nearly defeated. Vines had entered the mortar. One shutter hung by a single hinge. The chimney listed slightly, as if listening to something underground. The yard was a tangle of burdock, sumac, and wild grape. A sheet of tin had blown against the back wall and beaten itself shiny in one corner. The outhouse, visible beyond a dead apple tree, leaned with the private shame of buildings nobody trusts. Yet it had walls. That was the fact she returned to, because facts were safer than longing. 4 walls, though one had cracked. A roof, though not enough of one. A door, a window facing the old road. A chimney that might, if cleaned and forgiven, take smoke upward. In the front sill, among grit and blown leaves, she saw the faint circular scars of coins. She crossed the yard. The front step was a single of limestone, split down the centre by frost. The door was thick, made of vertical boards held by cross-battens, its lower edge chewed by rotten mice. Miriam took the plain brass key from the corner of her dress. It took her 3 tries to fit it into the lock because her fingers had stiffened during the walk. The key turned halfway, stopped, then moved again with a dry internal scrape. The door opened inward. Cold air came out first. It smelled of whetstone, mouse nests, dead leaves, soot, and the deep closed odour of a place that had not been asked to shelter anyone in years. Miriam waited at the threshold until her eyes adjusted. Morning light entered behind her and stretched across the floor in a weak rectangle. The front room had been both office and passage. A counter ran along one wall beneath the iron cashier's window, its boards bowed but still attached. Behind the counter stood a narrow stool overturned on its side. Old nails showed where rate noters might once have hung. The plaster had failed in broad patches, revealing lath-like ribs beneath skin. In the corner near the chimney, a bird had built a nest on top a broken shelf, and beneath it lay a scatter of feathers, twigs, and white droppings hardened by time. The floor was white pine, darkened almost black in pathways where boots had crossed for generations. Some boards had cupped with damp. Others were missing at the edges where animals had entered. When Miriam set one foot down, the plank answered with a long, low complaint, not breaking, but warning. She listened. There was wind in the chimney. There was water ticking somewhere toward the back. There was the fainter scratch of something small retreating inside the wall. No human sound came after hers. She stepped fully inside and shut the door. The silence changed once the door closed. Out silence had stitched in it tree, road, fields, crows. Inside silence was nearer. It gathered around the shoulders. It held the sound of her breathing and gave it back to her. Altered. Miriam set the flour sack bag on the counter. Dust lifted around it in a pale breath. She crossed to the cashier's window and looked through the iron bars at the abandoned road. From inside, the road seemed less forgotten and paused. Leaves lay where wagons, horses, mail coaches, freight teams, and later automobile had once passed. The curve beyond the walnuts disappeared into brush. If a traveller came now, he would have to come slowly. Behind the counter, the well was brick from floor to shoulder height, newer than the limestone around it. The bricks were uneven, their mortar rough, as if the work had been done by tired hands and not by a mason hired for appearance. Miriam noticed this only briefly. At the time, it was simply one more damaged surface among many. The back room was smaller and darker. She found it through a low doorway near the chimney. The smell changed there, becoming sharp with mildew and old ashes. A rusted cook stove stood against the rear wall, missing one lid and one foot. Beside it, a tin basin lay upside down on the floor. There was a cupboard with no doors, a table frame without its top, and a narrow built-in bunk or bench along the wall, though the boards had softened too much to trust. In the corner, a stack of newspapers had melted together into grey lump. She could make out one date on the top sheet, 9962. A back door to a yard pressed close by sumac. Beyond it, the privy leaned near the apple tree. And farther off, water moved through a ditch or small creek hidden by weeds. The thing was thin but steady. Miriam stood there with one hand on the door frame, letting the place tell her what it had and what it lacked. Water, somewhere outside. A stove, not yet safe. A chimney, not yet known. Walls, still standing. A floor, mostly there. A door that locked. She returned to the front room and began the first inventory in her head, the way Hannah Law had once taught her to prepare a table before painting. Nothing useful came from panic. You named what was before you. You laid it in order. You began with what your hands could touch. She opened the bag and removed her dress. Stockings. Comb. Pencil. Muslin scrap. And the folded tulip paper. The dress she shook once and hung from a nail near the chimney. The stockings she laid across the counter. The comb went into her coat pocket. The pencil she set on the sill beside the deed envelope. The muslin scrap she unfolded and placed on the counter, weighting it with a small stone from the floor. It was the only colour in the room. Blue and red pigments, faded but stubborn, marked the cloth in lit accidental fields. She looked at it longer than she meant to. Then she folded again and put it away. There was work even before work. The first was clearing a place to sleep. She found a broom in the back room. Its handle cracked, its straw worn on one side. It shed almost as much it swept, but it moved the leaves into piles. She cleared the front corner farthest from the broken window, pushing mouse droppings, plaster crumbs, dead beetles, bird feathers, and acorn shells toward the door. Twice she had to stop and warm her fingers under her arms. Dust entered her throat. She coughed into her sleeve, waited. and continued. By noon, light had strengthened enough to reveal the room more honestly. Honesty did not improve it. There were stains down the north well where roof water had travelled. The ceiling sagged near one beam. A hole above the back doorway showed a patch of pale sky. The chimney throat was black with creosote, and when she held her hand near the opening, a fall of soot sprinkled her knuckles. The counter beneath the cashier's window had pulled away from the wall, leaving a dark seam. The window itself gave no protection from wind. Every gap made itself known. Still, the floor corner was cleaner. She carried dead leaves outside in her skirt because there was no bucket. She found stones and set them along the bottom of the door where daylight entered. She pulled a length of rotted burlap from beneath the counter, shook it outside until it rose, then folded it twice and laid it on the cleared boards. It would not be warm. It would be something between her body and the floor. In the afternoon, she walked the property. The yard was narrower than it first seemed, held between the old road and a shallow run of water at the back. The creek, if it could be called that, moved through mud and flat stones before slipping beneath a tangle of roots. Ice had formed along its edges in thin glass shelves. She knelt and touched the water, then smelled her fingers. Cold, mineral, leaf-stained. Not enough to trust for drinking without boiling, but enough for washing. Perhaps. Once she had a pot that held. Near the privy, she found the old well. It had been capped with boards and a sheet of rusted tin weighted by 2 stones. She did not lift it fully, only enough to see darkness below and smell the damp breath rising from it. The boards went back at once. Wells, like chimneys and men with ledgers, deserved caution until proven sound. A walnut tree stood behind the house, larger than the rest, its limbs reaching outward with the authority of age. At its base lay brackened hulls from the autumn crop, their scent sharp and bitter when crushed underfoot. One limb had grown around a strip of old iron, swallowing it slowly into the bark. Miriam noticed the wound and touched it with 2 fingers, feeling the tree's patient refusal to let go. As evening approached, the temperature fell again. The damp inside the Tollhouse became colder than the air outside. Miriam had no safe fire. Not yet. She knew enough not to trust a chimney because she wanted warmth. Wanting warmth had killed people. Smoke did not forgive wishful thinking, so she prepared for the night without it. She dragged the burlap close to the well beneath the counter, where the wind from the broken panes passed above rather than directly through her. She stuffed newspaper from the melted stack into gaps where it could do some good, using only the pages that still came apart. She took loose plaster chunks and waited. She closed the back door with effort, lifting it by the latch because the hinges had sagged. She tested the front lock twice. Then she ate the remaining bread. Outside, the abandoned turnpike darkened before the sky did. The old road became a long, low absence between the trees. Miriam sat on the floor with her back against the stone wall and watched the last light leave the cashier's window. For a little while, the iron bars a dull red shine from sunset. Then they became black lines against grey glass. The room made its evening sound. Water ticked into pans somewhere she had not yet found. A board lifted and settled as the air cooled. Something small moved beneath the back room cupboard, paused, and moved again. Wind entered through the roof hole and crossed the ceiling with a sound like cloth being drawn over a table. Miriam pulled her coat around her knees. The deed envelope lay inside her dress. Under the coat, where no damp could reach it, her sack bag served as pillow. The plain key remained tied in the seam. She did not remove her shoes, because cold feet were difficult to reclaim once surrendered. She tried to picture the building as it had been when it was still useful. A lantern on the counter. A ledger open. Hooves in the road. Men calling through weather. Coin set down wet from rain or warm from palm. A woman sweeping the threshold at dusk. Smoke rising straight from the chimney. Someone latching the door at night with the tired satisfaction of a place honestly kept. The picture came and went. The actual room remained. That was better. Dreams could make a person careless. The room, with its broken plaster and bitter cold, asked for plain devotion. It did not promise comfort. It asked whether she could stay long enough to learn its needs. Near midnight, she woke from a shallow sleep to a sound outside. A slow crunch on the road. Then another. She held still beneath the coat. The sound came closer, stopped near the cashier's window, and for one breath she felt the building's whole history gather round that old opening. Traveller. Toll. Exchange. Passage. A deer lowered its head beyond the broken pane, visible as a darker shape against the snowless ground. Its breath clouded once. It turned one ear toward the house. Listening. Miriam did not move. After a while, the deer crossed the road and entered the brush. She slept again near dawn, when the cold had become so complete it seemed less like weather than an object laid over her. Light woke her by inches. It entered through the broken panes, the roof gap, the seams in the door, and the thin places where mortar had failed. No single beam warmed anything. Together, they made the room visible. Miriam sat up slowly. Her back ached. Her fingers were stiff. Dust had marked one cheek where she had slept against her sleeve. The burlap had printed its coarse pattern through her skirt. Nothing had improved while she slept, but the door was still closed. The deed was still dry. The walls remained upright. She stood, folded the burlap, shook out her coat, and opened the front door to the morning. The abandoned turnpike lay under pale sky, the walnuts holding their bare branches over it. Far off, a dog barked once and stopped. Water moved behind the house. The air smelled of whetstone, leaf mould, cold ashes, and the faint metallic promise of work. Miriam stepped onto the cracked limestone slab and looked at the road that had brought her there. Some roads are not abandoned. Only waiting for the right hands to find them, morning gave Miriam no welcome beyond light. But light was enough to begin with. She started by learning what the Tollhouse did after sunrise. The front room warmed first along the floorboards nearest the cashier's window, where the broken panes allowed a thin blade of pale sun to enter. The back room remained cold, holding the night in its stone like water held in a crock. At the threshold between the two rooms, a person could feel the change through the soles of her shoes. One room permitting the day, the other withhold it. She worked without fire. The first 3 days became a study in limits. She did not try to repair everything, because everything was too large a word. She named the immediate tasks and obeyed them. Water, waste, wind, floor, door, food. Each word became a small authority. The well frightened her most. On the first morning, she turned to it with a length of rotted rope found beneath the counter and a broken sash weight tied to one end. She lifted the boards carefully, testing each with her foot before trusting her hands, then lowered the iron weight in the dark. It fell longer than she expected before touching water with a sound so distant it seemed to come from another room underground. When she pulled it back, the wet portion of the rope smelled mineral, cold, and faintly of leaves. That did not make the water safe. She tore a strip from the least useful part of the flour sack bag, tied it over the mouth of a cracked jar found in the cupboard, and filtered a small amount from the creek instead, then set it aside until she could boil it somewhere else. Want made her impatient, but Hannelaw's voice had trained patience in the bones of her hands. Anything invisible could still harm you. That was true of bad water, loose chimneys, and grief. The outhouse received the same caution. She approached it with a fallen branch held before her like a measuring rod. The little structure had weathered silver and leaned toward the apple tree as if in confidential conversation. She tested the threshold. It sank. She stepped back at once. A gap in the floor showed blackness below and the pale gleam of frost against one interior board. No convenience was worth falling through. She made a temporary screen from burlap and dead sumac behind the far side of the walnut tree. Ashamed at first, then too practical to remain ashamed. The floor began to speak to her by the second day. The front room had 6 true complaints and 3 false ones. The true complaints came from planks that bent under weight and lifted at the ends. The false ones came from boards that groaned without danger, protesting age more than failure. She learned to cross from the door to the counter by stepping first on the wide board near the sill, then the narrow one beside the nail head, then the dark plank whose sen held though its edges curled. At night, when she moved half awake, her feet remembered before her mind did. The back room was less honest. One board near the cook stove gave no warning before dipping under her heel. She marked it with a charcoal X. Another, near the cupboard, had been patched with pine much newer than the rest, and the patch held well enough if she kept to the right side. By the 3rd evening, she could walk through both rooms in darkness without making the worst boards answer. On the 4th morning, hunger sent her back toward town. She had $1.12, a deed, wet shoes, and a list of needs longer than any list she could pay for. The walk took most of the morning because she stopped twice to rest her heels and once to speak gently to the brown hound that had followed her along a fence line, tail low, nose busy with her pocket. The town looked almost prosperous after the Tollhouse, glass windows, lit signs, clean steps, smoke rising from chimneys that did not threaten to send death back into the room. She entered Keener's Hardware because its front window had shown lamp wicks, nails, stovepipe, and other plain promises. A bell above the door rang once. The interior smelled of linseed oil, iron, sawdust, kerosene, rope, and the particular dryness of seed packets kept too close to a stove. Narrow aisles ran between crowded shelves. Coffee cans held boats sorted by size. A rack of hand tools stood near the counter, each handle worn darker where real work would grip it. Above the nail bins hung a fly strip no longer doing much service, and behind the counter stood an elder man in a brown canvas apron with a pencil tucked behind one ear. His hair was white and combed straight back with water. One eyebrow had a gap through it, an old scar crossing the skin like a pale stitch. His hands were large enough to make a hammer seem delicate. A sign on the counter said hardware, accounts settled Friday. He looked at her shoes first. Hardware men, like farmers, reed shoes. What are you fixing? Miriam had not expected that question. She had expected suspicion, perhaps pity, perhaps the slow dismissal clerks gave when no money showed itself. A chimney first, she said. Then windows. Maybe the roof if it does not fall before I learn how. He studied her for several seconds. "You're the one bought the toll place?" "Yes." "Sir." The man took the pencil from behind his ear and rolled it once between his fingers. "Name's Arthur Keener. My father kept this store before me. I remember when boys used to dare each other to throw stones through that toll window. County boarded it twice. Boards never lasted. I need to clean the chimney before I use it. That chimney may need more than cleaning. I figured it might. That a fairer answer than most. He came around the counter with a limp she might not have noticed if the store had been louder. At the stove aisle, he pulled down a wire chimney brush, shook dust from its bristles, and held it up to judge the diameter. "You know the flue size?" "No." "Sir." "Then you do not buy yet." He put it back. "First thing, measure. Second, look for cracked liner if it has one, which it may not. Third, check draft with paper, not with a full fire. Fourths, do not trust a chimney because it lets smoke go up once. Creosote can burn like coal oil if you give it a chance." Miriam nodded, holding each instruction. "I have very little money," she said. Arthur Keener looked toward the ceiling, as if asking the plaster for patience. Then he walked back behind the counter, opened a drawer, and removed a ledger book with a green cover worn white at the corners. "You can have an account. I do not know when I can pay. I did not say charge the whole store. I said an account." He turned the pages. "You buy what keeps you alive and what keeps the building from killing you. Nothing fancy. Nothing guessed. You bring me measurements. You bring me questions before you bring me trouble. I can work. I expect you will have to." He wrote her name slowly, not asking how to spell it because county news travelled in places where official papers did not. Then he went to a shelf near the back and returned with a paperback manual. Its cover torn, its title fade by handling, "Home Repair for Farm and Country Dwellings." A coffee ring marked the chapter on roof. "This belonged to my brother," he said. "He is past need it. You bring it back when you know more than it does. I cannot pay for it. I did not ask you to." She took it with both hands. Together, they made a list, not of wishes, but of first defences. One galvanized bucket, dented, reduced to 60 cents. One used lantern without globe, no charge until a globe could be found. One Bach common nails, 32 cents. One packet of 3-inch cut nails for old framing, 21 cents. 10 feet of cotton sash cord, 18 cents. Though he told her not to waste it on windows until the roof had stopped speaking. 1 pound of plumber's oakum, 15 cents, for temporary gaps. A small tin of stove cement, 49 cents. 1 wire brush, used, 20 cents. 2 sheets of tar paper from a damaged roll, marked at 11 cents each. A cracked enamel cup, 5 cents. A copy of the Cowan Agricultural Bulletin on safe wells, free because the state had already paid for it. The list came to $2.20, more than she could pay and less than the building required. Arthur Keener marked $1 paid, though she had give him 75 cents. When Miriam opened her mouth, he looked at her over the ledger. Do not correct a man in his own book unless he has cheated. She closed her mouth. He wrapped the small items in brown paper and tied them with string. The tar paper he rolled tight and tucked under her arm. The bucket swung from her hand on the walk back, clanging softly against her knee. By the time she reached the walnut track, The sky had cleared, and the late sun shone low through the trees, striking the old road in broken gold. The next morning, she measured the chimney. She tied a stone to the sash cord, climbed on the hearthstones, and lowered it carefully up into the throat, feeling along the brick with one hand. The flue narrowed, widened, and narrowed again. No liner, just old brick, soot, and whatever patience remained in the mortar. When she pulled her hand back, her fingers were black past the knuckle. Cleaning it took 9 hours across 2 days. She began from below because the roof was not yet safe enough to truss. First, she spread the least ruining newspakes across the hearth and pinned their corners with stones. Then she used the wire brush to scrape what she could reach, working upward in short hard strokes until soot fell into her hair, onto her sleeves, into her collar, and across her face. The smell was bitter and oily. Creosote clung in glossy black plates near the lower throat, some pieces thick as broken china. She pried them loose with the bent handle of a spoon found in the cupboard, tapping gently where the brick sounded weak. When the lower section would yield no more, she tied the brush to the sash cord, weighted the far end with the iron sash weight, and worked from the roof edge without putting her full weight on the damaged slope. She reached the chimney by climbing the walnut tree at the back, crossing to the lower roof of to with one knee in both palms, then staying on the rafters she could see beneath the missing slate. It was foolish enough to frighten her and careful enough to accomplish. She lowered the weight down the flue, then drew the brush after it, sawing up and down in slow deliberate pulls. Soot fell below in heavy sigh. Twice the brush caught, and she had to stop, breathe, and ease it free without jerking loose a brick. Her arms trembled by the end of the first afternoon. By evening, her neck ached from looking upward, and her palms had opened in 2 narrow blisters. On the second day, she tested the draft with twisted newspaper. She lit only end and held it near the throat, standing ready to smother it in the bucket if smoke turned back. The flame bent inward. A thin strand of smoke lifted, hesitated, then disappeared in the dark above. She let the paper burn no larger than her thumb before crush it cold against the hearth. The chimney had accepted a question. It had not yet earned trust. She walked back to Keena's with soot still in the creases of her face and reported exactly what she had found. No liner. Heavy creosote. Loose mortar in the upper left side. Uncertain crown. Draft present but weak until warmed. Arthur listened without interrupting. Then he sold her 6 fire bricks from behind the shop for 12 cents apiece, 3 because their corners were chipped, and wrote stove cement into the account without naming a price. First fire small, he said. Twigs. Then wrist thick wood. No roaring. Keep your hand near the wall. If stone heats where it should not, you stop. Yes. Sir. Keep water. Yes. Sir. Stay away. Yes. Sir. The first fire was no larger than a hat. She built it on a shallow bed of ash cleared from the old hearth, using dry twigs gathered beneath the spruce trees farther down the road and shavings Arthur had swept into feed sack for her. The flame took slowly, blue at the base, yellow at the tips, uncertain as a new calf. Smoke curled in the room once, then found the throat and rose. Miriam crouched before it with the bucket of creek water beside her, one hand resting against the stone wool, feeling for heat where heat should not be. For an hour, she fed it only kindling. The room did not become warm. Warmth was too generous a word. But the air changed. Damp withdrew a little from the hearthstones. Her fingers stopped hurting. The smell of soot gave way to the smell of wood, sharp and clean, threaded with old ash. She kept look at the flame as if it were an animal that might bolt or bite. When the fire had held steady for 2 hours, she set the cracked enamel cup near the coals with creek water strained through cloth. It trembled before it boiled. She watched the first bubbles gather along the cup's chipped rim and felt no triumph, only careful gratitude. In the boiled water she stirred cornmeal purchased at the feed store for 9 cents. With a pinch of salt Arthur had folded into paper without writing it down. Her first hot meal in the Tollhouse was thin corn mush eaten from a cup with a bent spoon. She ate half, waited, then ate the rest. Steam warmed her nose. The fire marked the walls in faint orange and showed every failure more clearly. The sagging plaster, the gaps, the water stains, the counter seam, the uneven brick behind the cashier's window. That was all right. A thing could be poor and still be honest. After the meal, she began the workroom inventory. She had delayed the back room because it was darker and less certain underfoot, but the building could not be understood from the front alone. She brought the lantern without its globe near the doorway in daylight and set the door open behind her. Then she took the pencil stub and began writing on the back of the county direction sheet, using small letters to save space. Cook stove. Rusted. 1 missing lid. 1 cracked firebox plate. Do not use. Tin basin. Dent but sound after cleaning. Cupboard frame. 3 shelves. No doors. Mouse damaged lower shelf. Table frame. No top. Peg joints. 1 leg split. Bench or bunk. Unsafe. Board soft at well. Newspaper stack. Damp. Dated 9962. Mostly waste. 2 fruit jars. 1 cracked. 1 usable. Iron hook. Ceiling beam. Broken crotch. Blue stripe. Possible use for dry storage if clean. 3 horseshoe nails in sill. 1 empty tobacco tin. 1 length of chain. Rusted. She worked the way Hannelore had taught her to work a border, line by line. No skipping because the eye wanted to hurry toward beauty. Intoy was a form of respect. Even useless things deserved to be known before being discarded. In the cupboard, behind the grey lump of newspapers, she found a torn flour sack from a mill in Mechanicsburg. Fold around 6 clothespins and a child's marble. The marble was green with a white twist at the centre, bright as a drop of summer in the dim room. She placed it on the sill and continued. Beneath the cookstove lay a mouse nest made of shredded paper, chicken feathers, and a strip of red thread. Behind the table frame, she found a rusted hinge, 2 square nails, and a piece of slate with rhythmic scratched into it. 3, 7, 1 on, 4 4, twain 2. Nothing was treasure because it was hidden. Most hidden things were only forgotten work. By late afternoon, she had cleared enough of the back room to see the well behind the cashier's counter from the other side. It was not part of the room exactly. The original toll window opened to the front, but behind its lower brickwork, a rectangular mass projected slight into the back wall, like a chimney breast with a flue. She had noticed the uneven brick from the front. From the rear, she could see that the projection was broader than the window, required and newer than the surrounding stone. She tapped it with the spoon handle. Brick answered differently than stone. That much she expected. But sound, when listened to carefully, had gradations. The right side gave a flat, dense note. The centre gave the same. The lower left sounded dull. Near the upper edge, just behind where the iron cashier's window met the wall, the spoon handle made a smaller, hollower sound, quick and wooden under the brick's hard face. She tapped again. Hollow. She marked the place with charcoal. The next day, she returned with more method. First, she measured the projection 4 feet 2 inches wide, 3 feet 8 inches high, 15 inches deep where visible. Then she measured the cashier's counter in the front room and the old window opening. The numbers did not reconcile. There was more thickness behind the window fan structure required. She pressed her shoulder against the brickwork and pushed. Nothing moved. She placed both palms on it. Cold. Dry. No draft. A sealed void. Perhaps. Or only bad masonry. She remembered Arthur's warning against guest trouble. But the building had begun asking a question. She was not ready to tear into it. Instead, she tested weight. From the yard, she brought 3 stones of increasing size. She set each on the counter directly above the suspicious portion, listening in the back room after every placement. The brick did not shift. No dust fell. Then she took the iron sash weight and rolled it lightly across the counter. When it passed over one spot near the cashier's window, something inside answered with the faintest separate knock. Not brick. Not stone. Wood. Miriam stood very still. There were many reasons a piece of wood might be sealed in a wall. Repair. Blocking. A forgotten form. A mason's laziness. A rat's old path. The mind, especially a hungry one, could make meaning from almost any sound. She made her leave it until morning. Morning dot make the sound go away. She borrowed a cold chisel from Arthur Keener after telling him only that she needed to remove failed mortar from an interior brick patch. That was true enough. He studied her face, then gave her the chisel and a small mason's hammer. Brick comes out slower than regret goes in, he said. I will go slower than that. She did. She began at the upper left corner where the mortar was roughest. The first taps did almost nothing. The second hour loosened a grey line of grit. She stopped often to brush dust away with a dry twig, watching for movement in the surrounding bricks. No movement came. The mortar had been mixed poorly, sandy and weak, as if made by some who knew only that bricks must be persuaded to hold together. By noon, the first brick shifted. She did not pry hard. She worked around it, tapping, brushing, waiting, tapping again, until at last it came free into her hand with a sigh of released dust. Behind it lay darkness and the edge of a round cedar disc, set upright like a stopper. The smell reached her before the sight made sense. Cedar. Dry. Sharp. Preserved beyond reason. Miriam sat back on her heels. Her hands were black with soot, brick dust, and old mortar. The loose brick lay beside her knee. Through the opening, no larger than a fist, the cedar disc showed a smooth curved edge, hand cut and fit into reset. Someone had placed it there deliberately. Someone had bricked it in. She removed 5 more bricks before the disc could be touched fully. Each brick came away with the same patient labour. Mortar dust whitened her sleeves. Once, a cut opened across one knuckle, and she wrapped it in cloth without leaving the wall. The cedar disc was about 14 inches across, darkened at the edges, with 2 finger holes bored near its centre. It resisted at first when she hooked her fingers through. Then it moved with a dry pop, releasing a breath air older than anyone she had known. Inside the void lay oilcloth. Not one bundle. Several. The first was long and narrow, wrapped tight with cord that had darkened almost to black. The second was broader, pressed flat, and tied in 3 places. A third sat behind them, square and firm. At the back, nearly hidden by dust, rested a tin canister sealed with wax around its lid. Miriam did not pull them out at once. She cleared the floor. She laid burlap down. She washed her hands in cold water, dried them on her skirt, then returned. Whatever waited inside that space had survived because other hands had been careful. She would not be the first careless one. The long bundle came free with a faint rasp against the brick. On the burlap, she untied the cord. It broke halfway through, too brittle to endure being asked. The oilcloth unfolded reluctantly. Holding crease made decks before. Inside lay a set of brushes. Not house brushes. Not broom ends. Painting brushes. They were small. Exact. Hand-turned from cherry wood. Each handle shaped with a slight swelling where thumb and forefinger would rest. Some were no longer than her palm. Others were thin as a reed. The bristles had been protected in little paper sleeves tied with thread. Beside them lay pigment pots, also cherry wood, with fitted lids no lard and timbals, each one marked by a tiny incise symbol tulip, bird, heart, star, vine. Miriam did not touch them at first. Her breath had altered, not louder, shallower. She saw Hannelore kitchen table. The muslin, the oyster shells, the ruined borders drying near the stove. She saw the old woman's stained thumbnail and heard, without wanting to hear, the correction given beside a crooked line. Slower. At last she lifted one brush. It weighed almost nothing. The wood had darkened with age and hand oil, though whose hand she could not yet know. Near the ferrule, in letters so small she had to carry it to the window, someone had carved L, S, K. The initials were worn but legible. The bristles remained pointed beneath their sleeve, protected in darkness by the cedar's clean breath and the stubbornness of sealed brick. The second bundle held linen. 3 bolts, narrow and long, hand-spun, still wrapped in oilcloth and bound with strips of undid cloth. When she opened one end, the fabric shone faintly cream-grey, not white, with the uneven life of thread made by human fingers. It smelled of flax, oil, and time. No mildew, no mouse damage, no rot. Whoever had sealed it had known how to keep damp away. Miriam laid the linen beside the brushes. Smooth only the outer wrapping. The square bundle contained paper. Sheets of heavy-laid paper. Not many, but enough to matter, pressed between 2 thin boards. Alongside them were small envelopes of dried pigment, red, yellow, blue, brown, black. Some had hardened into cakes. Some remained powder fine. Each packet had a label written in brown ink madder. Ochre, indigo, walnut, lamp black. Beneath the fold Union Army discharge letter dated April 9. 8865. The paper fragile but clean. Its form lines naming a man whose surname matched the carved initials on the brush. She read only the date, then stopped. There was too much. The tin canister remained. It was cylindrical, about 7 inches long, sealed around the lid with dark wax that had cracked but not failed. On its side, someone had scratched a hex sign with the point of a knife, 6 petals inside a circle, the lines worn pale against the dull metal. Miriam held it in both hands and felt something shift inside, not loose enough to rattle carelessly, but present. She set it down and went outside. The air had turned afternoon blue. She stood beneath the walnut tree with brick dust on her skirt and cedar on her hands. The creek moved through brown leaves. A crow crossed the road and landed in the apple tree, folding its wings with severe dignity. She pressed both palms together until they stopped shaking. Then she went back in. The wax took time to remove. She warmed the knife blade near the small fire, not enough to melt everything at once, only enough to soften a section. The lid resisted. She worked around it slowly, turning the canister, easing the old seal free. When it finally opened, the sound was small and final. Inside lay a letter wrapped around a bundle of currency, with coins tucked in a cloth pouch beside it. She saw the handwrite on the outer fold and closed her eyes. Not because she recognized the hand. She did not. Because she recognized the discipline of it. The letters were formed by some who had practiced beauty until beauty could survive even sorrow. Black ink, slight browned, downstrokes steady, capitals ornamented without waste. She did not read it. Not yet. She removed the currency first, because counting was simpler than receiving words. The bills were old, some silver certificates, some United States notes, some worn soft from use before being bundled. 10s, 5s, 2s, 1s. The paper smelled faintly metallic, faintly sweet. Around them was a strip of linen tied in a square knot. Written on the strip in the same careful hand was, "For keeping the house in honest repair." She counted twice. $400 in bills. In the cloth pouch were coins, 3 Morgan silver dollars dated 8883. 2 Barber half dollars, 7 Indian head cents. A Liberty head nickel worn almost smooth and 23 cents in mixed small change, mostly wheat pennies darkened by age. At the bottom of the pouch lay a military medal with a faded ribbon, its bronze face bearing the year 98 and an eagle whose wings had softened under handling. Altogether, with the coins, there was $400.73. The number sat on the floor between hunger and impossibility. Miriam wrote it down because writing a thing made it less likely to become a dream. 473. She wrote it carefully beneath the inventory list, then placed the pencil beside the coins and stared at the figures until they steadied. $400 could buy shingles, stovepipe, window glass, flour, beans, lamp oil, nails, time. It could also disappear if treated like rescue instead of responsibility. She knew this with a clarity that did not need explaining. Money was not a miracle. Money was a tool. Tools could build or vanish, depending on the hand. She rewrapped the bills in their linen strip. The letter lay unopened beside the canister. The room had darkened around her. The small fire had burned low, showing red under ash. The brush rested in a row on the burlap, their cherry handles catching what little light remained. The linen bolts were still wrapped. The pigment packed like sleeping sea. The Union discharge letter. Iron plate outside. The medal. The coins. The cedar disc. The sealed brick. All of it seemed to belong to one long sentence written across decades by people who had not known her and yet had left their work where her hands could find it. She could not read the letter that night. Her body refused. Or perhaps some older instinct vised delay. Words could alter a room more violently than tools. Once read, they could not be unread. The handwrite would become a voice. The voice would ask something of her. She was not ready to know what. So she placed the letter back inside the tin canister without sealing it, wrapped the canister in the cleanest part of the burlap, and set it beneath the counter. She moved the brushes and pigments away from the hearth, safe from sparks. She laid the linen bolts on the table frame after testing it again. Then she replaced the cedar disc loosely over the opening, not to hide what had been found, but to keep the night air from entering the chamber too quickly. Outside. The lust was gone. Miriam opened the back door and stepped into the cold. The creek behind the Tollhouse carried the day away in a narrow silver thread. She followed a little distance, careful among root-swept stones, until the house stood behind her as a dark square against the deeper dark of trees. There, where the water bent around a flat limestone shelf, she crouched and washed brick dust from her hands. The cold bit cleanly. Red water from her split knuckle tinned and vanished downstream. She stayed there longer than needed. Above the ridge, a few stars appeared between moving clouds. The walnut branches lifted and crossed in brack lines. Somewhere beyond the old turnpike, a dog barked twice, then accepted whatever answer the night gave. The Tollhouse did not glow. The fire inside was too low to show through the broken panes. From where she crouched, it looked abandoned still. But it was not the same. A sealed place had opened. A hand from another life had reached. Not dramatically, not loudly, but with the exact pressure of a brush guided along paper. Miriam dried hands on her skirt and stood. She did not feel rich. She did not feel saved. Those would have been large, careless feelings. And the evening allowed only smaller truth. There was a letter waiting. There were tools that had not been ruined. There was work enough for winter. She walked back slowly, listening to the creek behind her and the old road beyond the front wall. At the door, she paused and looked once towards the cashier's window, where the iron bars held darkness in their narrow spaces. Then she entered, closed the door, and sat beside the hearth without touching the canister again. Some roads are not abandoned, only waiting for the right hands to find them by morning. The handride had become harder to avoid than hunger. It waited inside the tin canister beneath the counter, wrapped in burlap, dry as a kept promise. Miriam knew where it lay without looking, while she rinsed the enamel cup at the creek, while she shook ash through the grate, while she measured the last of the cornmeal into her palm. The letter remained present in the room with a patience more exacting than speech. She built the smallest fire she could manage and set water near it. Not for tea. There was no tea. Only hot water to hold between her hands while the day strengthened. The front room received the first grey light, and the cashier's window cast bars across the floorboards. Those narrow shadows reached almost to the hearth. Miriam cleared the counter. She moved the brushes to one side, each handle laid parallel, each paper sleeve still in place. She set the pigment packets beside them, then linen wrapped bills, then the cloth pouch of coin. The Union discharge letter remained folded, untouched except for the corner she had seen. The medal rest atop the pouch, its worn ribbon like a faded strip of sunset. Last came the tin canister. The wax clung to its rim. She lifted the letter out. The paper had been folded in third, then rolled loosely to fit the canister, and after so many years it wanted to keep both shapes at once. She did not force it. She laid it flat in her palms and waited for the curl to ease. The ink had browned, but it had not faded beyond legibility. The downstrokes were firm. The lines did not wander. Whoever had written it had placed sorrow under discipline before setting pen to paper. On the outside fold, in smaller letters, was written, "For the one who opens what I could not." Miriam read that line 3 times. Then she unfolded the letter completely, smoothing along the old creases with the side of her hand, and began. "My dear one, whoever you are, if you are reading this, then the well has come open, and I am no longer living to be ashamed of what I shut away. I do not know your name, or whether you come by blood, by purchase, by mercy, or by accident. I have learned not to measure providence too quickly. Many things arrive by roads we did not choose, and some of them are kinder than we deserve. My name is Lydia Susanna Krause, born Lydia Susanna Ebersol, in the year 869 near Newburgh in Cumberland County. I write this in the Tollhouse on the 15th day of October, when 999, with my right side paining me and my hand slower than it once was. Doctor, Elias Wentworth in Harrisburg has told me the swelling in my breast has gone where his knife cannot follow. He said it gently, which made it no less true. I have put my affairs in such order as a woman with little property and fewer living kin may do. I write because tools should not be buried without witness. My mother was Anna Maria Ebersol, born 844 near Ephrata, daughter of Johannes Ebersol, a schoolmaster and paper cutter, and Katharina Riest, whose people came from the Palatinate before the Revolution, settling first in Lancaster County, then moving west by wagon when good limestone land could still be had by hard work and a long patience. My father was Peter Ebersol, born 838 outside Carlisle, apprenticed to a joiner, later a maker of chests, cradles, and coffins. It was from him I learned the weight of cherry wood, and from my mother I learned that a line drawn by hand carries the breath of the one who drew it. My grandmother, Magdalena Riest, born 888, made birth records with angels whose wings were no wider than a thumbnail. Her mother before her, Susanna Weber, born Wren 91 near Littitz, kept a little book of colours and receipts, how to grind madder, how to temper gum, how to keep mice from paper through winter, how to speak blessing without making a show of holiness. That book came to me through my mother, with stains from 3 kitchens and 1 barn fire along the bottom edge. I married Samuel Krause in 8888, when the locust trees were white and my hands were still too proud of their own steadiness. He kept toll here first under his uncle, then under the company itself. He had a laugh that could startle horses and a way of mending harness by lantern light that made even broken leather seem willing to serve again. In the early years, I painted at this very counter between travellers. I made house blessings, marriage records, birth certificates, book plates, and small rewards for children who learn their letters. Samuel cut the brush handles from cherry limbs after the February pruning, and I tied the bristles while he sharpened quills. We were not rich. We were well occupied. The trade began closing before my grief did. The railroad took one kind of traveller. The motor car took another. The new drew wagons away from the ridge. and men who once stopped to pay began passing elsewhere in clouds of dust. But the true wound in our household came earlier, on July 21, 8877, when the great railroad strike reached across Pennsylvania like a summer storm made of hunger and iron. I was a child, but I remember my father closing the shutters, though we lived miles from the worst of it. Men were angry in Pittsburgh, Harrisburg, Reading, and beyond, and troops moved where workers had once moved freight. My brother Matthias, only 17, had gone east with a rail crew 2 months before. He came home with his left hand crushed, not by any soldier, but by a coupling during the confusion when work was stopped and stopped again by men who no longer trusted orders. He could no longer cut paper. He could no longer hold the small knife. After that, our family made fewer fractures. People bought less beauty when bread itself felt uncertain. There were other losses. My father carried his Union discharge letter from the spring of 1865 folded inside his Bible, dated April 9, the very day Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. He had served and returned, which is not the same as coming home whole. My son Daniel did not return from France. He died in 988, not in a grand charge as newspapers prefer, but of influenza in a camp hospital after carrying stretchers until his own lungs filled. The medal in this canister was sent with a letter that used the word grateful twice. I have kept it because a mother keeps what is sent, even when Pay cannot tell the truth of a boy's absence. Samuel died this past February on the old road west of the Tollhouse, where the logging team came down too fast after freezing rain. A chain snapped. One horse went sideways. A load of oak turned over near the bend. They said he was killed at once. I was grateful for that and hated being grateful. I have not painted since. The tools in this well were ours together. The cherry handles were turned by Samuel's hand. The pigments were ground by mine. The linen was spun by my mother and saved for work I believed I still had years to finish. I sealed them because each object accused me of continuing. Perhaps that was cowardice. Perhaps it was mourning. I can tell the difference every day. If you mean to use them, do not begin with the finest paper. Begin with scraps. Always begin with scraps. Warm the room if you can, but do not let it grow damp. Pigment lies when the air is wet. Mix gum arabic, 1 part gum to 2 parts clean water, and let it stand near gentle heat until it loosens. Do not boil it. Strain it through linen. For madder, grind with a drop of honey no larger than a lentil to keep the colour from drying brittle. Ochre will forgive you more than indigo. Lamp black will not forgive a careless sleeve. If you make walnut ink, crack the hulls after they have brackened. Cover with rainwater. Simmer 3 hours, but never hard, and add a spoon of vinegar to help it keep. For paper sizing, warm weak gelatin until it feels slippery between finger and thumb. Then brush once and let dry flat beneath light weight. Do not work because the sheet has rested a full day. When you draw letters, make the stem first, then the foot, then the flourish only after the letter can stand without it. A life is much the same. Ornament can't save a weak structure. If you paint tulips, remember they are not flowers only. They are cups held open. Birds must look as if they know where they are going. Hearts should never be too red. Too much red makes grief look vain. The linen in this well is not for sale unless hunger leaves no other door. The money is for repair, not display. Mend the roof before you mend appearances. A dry wall is worth more than a polished floor. Keep account of what you spend, not because money is holy, but because waste is a form of forgetting those who worked before us. If you are kin, then know you were wanted before you were named. If you are not kin, then know that inheritance is sometimes chosen by need and care rather than blood. What matters is not whose face resembles whose, but whose hands are willing to continue without applause. Have lived here through toll bells, floods, quarrels, births, funerals, bad winters, good apples, 2 wars, and more ordinary meals than anyone would think worth recording. Yet ordinary meals are the true record. A table wiped, a cup set down, a broom by the door, a lamp trimmed, a child's name painted so carefully his mother cries in her apron and pretends it is the smoke. Should you find this place empty, do not believe emptiness too quickly. Houses remember heat. Walls remember hands. Roads remember every footstep, even the ones that turn away. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Lydia Susanna Krause, formerly Ebersole, Tollhouse west of Carlisle, October fine, 9999. Miriam did not move when the letter ended. The fire had lowered itself to red seam bin ash. Outside, wind pressed at the broken panes and found every place where glass was missing. The paper lay open beneath her hands. She could see the slight tremor in the last line, where the ink thickened and tinned as if the writer had paused more often near the end. She read it a second time. The words did not become easier. They became more exact. Names gathered weight. Anna Maria, Johannes, Katharina, Magdalena, Susanna, Samuel, Daniel, Matthias, Peter. A lineage did not rise before her like a grand staircase. It came instead as a table crowded with working hands, each one passing something humble to the next, because humble things were the only ones that survived ordinary ruin. When she finished again, she folded the letter along its original creases. Not new creases. Not her own. She let the paper remember how it had been closed the first time. The act steadied her. Fold bottom. Fold top. Press lightly. Do not flatten what age has made fragile. She placed the letter back inside the canister, then removed it again almost at once. A foolish movement, perhaps. But she was not ready to bury the voice in tin. Instead, she wrapped it in clean paper and laid it beside the brushes. The letter had mentioned the road west of the Tollhouse. Samuel's Bend. Miriam put on a coat and went out the back door, though the passage west lay nearer the front. She did not want to step first into the old road from the cashier's side. Not yet. She circled the house slowly, passing the cracked step, the iron window, the cast plate, the weeds stiff with frost. The abandoned turnpike lay quite beneath the trees, its scent seam grown over in winter grass. She walked west. The bend was not far. There, the road dipped slightly and curved around a walnut tree larger than the rest. Its trunk had split long ago and healed around the wound, forming a dark vertical seam like a closed mouth. At the base, half hidden beneath leaves and fallen husks, lay a horseshoe set upright between 2 stones. Time had sunk it deep. Rust had sealed its lower to the earth. Miriam knelt. The horseshoe was not random. Someone had placed it there. Behind it, pressed flat against the trunk by years of growth, was a narrow strip of tin, almost swallowed by bark. She brushed leaves aside until her fingers found the edge of a small marker stone no higher than her hand. No carved name remained, if one had ever been there. only a cross scratched lightly into the surface. And beneath it, 3 worn letters. S. K. The logging accident had left no monument for passing eyes. Only this. A horseshoe. A stone. A tree that had grown around Silence for nearly 60 years. Miriam sat back on her heels. The cold came through the ground into her knees. She did not cry in any visible way. Her body had become too careful with water. Instead, she removed one glove, laid her bare palm on the wall and bar, and held it there until the cold entered her skin. On the walk back, she gathered fallen twigs for fire. Near the rear well, half buried beneath a mat of leaves, she saw the mouth of a crock she had missed before. It had cracked in 2 places, but still held with it a bundle of tallow candles wrapped in brittle paper and tied with string. Mice had nibbled the wrapper. The candles remained mostly sound, yellowed with age, faintly dusty. Each wick bent flat against the wax. Inside the house, she carried one to the hearth. It might have been 60 years old, perhaps more. The tallow had hardened and bloomed with a white powder that came away on her fingers. She set it upright in the broken crock, packing ash around its base to hold it straight. Then she took a twig from the fire, waited until its end glowed, and touched it to the wick. The candle resisted. Smoke rose first, thin and sour. The wick blackened. Then a small flame appeared, bent sideways, straightened, and took hold. The light it gave was modest, browner than lamp flame, but it changed the room more than the fire had. Fire lit the hearth. The candle lit the counter. It found the cherry brush handles and gave them a low sheen. It touched the linen wrappings, the coin pouch, the letter, the cedar disc leaning beside the open wall. The Tollhouse, for a few minutes, looked less like a condemned structure than a room where someone had stepped away and might return. Miriam sat before the candle until the flame steadied. She began to understand that she had not arrived by one kindness, but by many small ones placed far apart. Mrs. Brindle had pressed the county stamp and told her to keep the paper dry. Arthur Keener had opened a count and pretended not to count 75 cents correctly. The farmer near Carlisle had let her sleep until sunup and told her only not to smoke. The woman in the Shippensburg bus station had left the sandwich on the windowsill and walked away before gratitude could make either of them uncomfortable. The Methodist janitor had given her raisin bread and coffee, then locked the door without shame or sermon. Small mercies had made a road where no road appeared on any map. She looked toward the broken cashier's window and imagined, not with drama, but with plain attention, all the people watching from other rooms, other states, other weather, people sitting beneath blankets after supper, people with dishes in the sink, people who had known a night when a door did not open, or a morning when a stranger's ordinary decency kept them from going under. If you are listening now, perhaps you have carried such a kindness longer than the giver ever knew. A sandwich left with a word, a ride offered in rain, a bill paid quietly, a porch light left on, a chair pulled nearer to the stove. Not the sort of act that enters newspapers, but the kind that keeps a person from becoming only what happened to them. Tell us, if you can, about one small kindness you were given when you needed it. There are people who need reminding that mercy still travels by hand. The candle shortened. Wax softened along one side and ran in the ash-packed crock. Miriam used the bent spoon to turn it slightly away from the draught. The room held its hush. Outside, The old road lay dark between the walnut tree. Inside, every object on the counter had entered her keeping not as wealth, but as instruction. She made a bed near the hearth that night. Before lying down, she wrapped the brushes again in their oilcloth, but not tightly enough to forget them. The linen bolts she stacked beside the well away from damp. The money she returned to the tin canister with the coin pouch and medal, though she kept the letter separate, folded in clean paper. The union discharge remained on top of the paper packet, where she could see the date but not yet read the whole of it. There would be time. She had learned the cost of opening too much at once. She placed the canister, the brushes, and the letter beside her sleeping place, close enough that her hand could reach them in darkness. The fire dropped low. The candle burned out with a brief blue thread of smoke. Cold returned to the corners, but not entirely. Some warmth remained in the stones. Some light remained behind her eyes. Miriam lay on the burlap, coat pulled over her, and listened to the building settle around the open wall. The house had not become safe. The roof still failed. The chimney still needed repair. The windows still admitted wind. The money could be lost through foolishness, stolen by someone stronger, or spent down to nothing before spring if she did not keep account. The letter had not ended hardship. It had only named her welcome. That was not little. In the dark, she placed one hand lightly on the wrapped brushes and slept with the heirlooms beside her. The first came on December 6th, 4 inches by noon, another inch after dark, lying lightly at first on the broken slate before finding every weakness in the roof. Miriam woke to the sound of water entering in more than one place. Not rainwater this time, but meltwater, slow and precise, dripping from the underside of the damaged rafters into pans, jars, the tin basin, and one cracked crock she had placed beneath the worst opening. The snow itself made the whirl appear gentler from the cashier's window, but gentleness above a ruined roof was only another form of weight. She stood on the front room floor with the repair manual open in both hands and read the chapter on roofing for the 3rd time. The first reading had shown her what she did not know. The second had shown her how many ways a person could make a roof worse. The third made the work narrow enough to begin. She copied the important lines onto brown paper: find sound rafters, replace or sister damaged one, lay felt from eave upward, overlap courses, keep nails covered, do not nail through exposed channels, do not walk on unsupported slate. The roof measured 20 feet across the front, 28 feet along the side, with a modest pitch that would have been fogging if the rafters had not suffered years of damp. Arthur Keener helped her calculate the first order at the hardware counter, using the invoice and a carpenter's pencil flattened on one side. 2 squares of asphalt shingles, not slate, because slate belonged to richer repair than winter allowed. 1 partial roll of 15-pound felt, 7 pounds of roofing nails, 1 1/4 inch, galvanized, 6 mops pine for patch sheathing, 2 less to buy, 6 for sister rafters, a small tin of roof cement for seams around the chimney. He added a bundle of lath strips from behind the store for no listed charge. Temporary can be honest, he said, if it tells the truth about what it is. Miriam wrote every price in a ledger made from folded paper. Shingles, $7.80. Felt, $1.10. Nails, 89 cents. Pine, $1.40. Rafters, $2 even. Roof cement, 62 cents. Delivery by Mr. Keener's nephew on his way toward a farm account. 50 cents written as 25. She paid from the old money for the first time with a single $5 bill. The bill seemed too large for the counter. Arthur held it a moment, glanced at its age, then placed it under the till drawer rather than into the tray. He gave her change without comment. That silence was one of his better kindnesses. The materials arrived 2 days later in the bed of a green pickup with a cracked windshield and a shovel sliding about loose in the back. With them came an elder man in a wool cap and coat so patched it looked quilted by weather. He stood in the yard studying the roof while the young driver unloaded. "That is less roof than argument," he said. Arthur had sent him. His name was Mr. Amos Rupp, though he told her to call him Rupp and nothing more. He had roofed barns, spring houses, summer kitchens, smokehouses, 2 churches, and 1 schoolhouse before his knees had begun to dispute ladders. He would not take pay. When Miriam tried to ask how she could accept such work, he spat into the snow, not near her, but with emphasis. "My sister had a place once," he said, "for taxes after her man died. Nobody helped. I remember." That was he offered by way of explanation. Arthur had also sent an old roofing hatchet that had belonged to his deceased brother, its head blackened, its nail notch worn smooth, its handle wrapped with dark tape near the end. Miriam held it carefully, feeling the balance. It was not new and did not pretend to be. The blade had been sharpened by someone who used tools until they became part of a day's language. Rupp began by teaching her not to climb. "You do not climb a roof because you are determined," he said. "You climb because the ladder stands right, the footing holds, and somebody below knows where you are. For 11 days, weather permitting and sometimes not permitting enough, they worked. They set the ladder feet on 2 flat stones so it would not sink in thawing ground. They tied the ladder to a wind bar with rope. They tested every rung. Rupp climbed first, slow but without fear, then showed Miriam how to move along rafters rather than guessing beneath brittle sheathing. His teaching was terse. That board line, step left. That nail's proud. Pull it. Again, not harder. This straighter. The worst rafter lay above the back room doorway, softened where water had entered around missing slate. Rupp showed her how to sister it. They cut 2 by 6 to length, slid it alongs the weakened timber, raised it with a pry board, and fastened it through sound wood with 16 penny nails driven at staggered angles. He made her set each nail with 3 strokes after the first tap, 1 to commit, 1 to drive, 1 to seat. If the hammer wandered, he had her pull the nail and begin again. Wood remembers insult, he said. She believed him. They patched sheathing where the roof had opened to sky, laying 1 by 6 boards across rafters and trimming them with the old hatchet when the saw teeth caught in frozen sap. Miriam learned to snap a chalk line by holding the string low, lifting at the centre, and letting it strike straight. The blue line startled her each time, a brief perfect mark across rough board. Rupp made her sight along it before laying felt. Eye first, hammer second. The felt went down from the eaves upward, each course overlapping the one below, so water would think only of leaving. The shingles followed in careful rows. Miriam's fingers split at the knuckles from cold and grit. Roof granules worked into her cuffs. At night, she found black crescents beneath her nails and tar at her wrists. Her shoulders ached deeply enough that lifting the enamel cup required attention. They did not speak much while working. Rupp hummed once in a while through his nose, tunelessly, and correct her with 1 or 2 words. At noon, they ate bread, beans, and slice of apple standing in the lee of the wall, refused coffee because she had none, and refused hot water because accepting it would have made her feel poorer. On the 7th day, snow began again while they were sealing the edge around the chimney. Rupp looked at the sky and swore once, softly, in Pennsylvania German, then worked faster without seeming hurried. The chimney flashing remained ugly but serviceable. Roof cement blackened the seam, felt tucked beneath shingle and overpatched board. Nothing about it would impress a man selling houses in town. But when the next thaw came, the pans inside the room caught less water, then none from that corner. On December 7/10, they finished the last row before dark. Rupp climbed down first, then watched Miriam descend. He untied the ladder, coiled the rope, and stood back in the yard with his hands on his hips. The roof line still sagged slightly where the years had bent it, but the open wounds were covered. The house no longer looked bareheaded before the weather. "That will hold," he said. Miriam waited for more. There was no more. He handed her the roofing hatchet. "Kina says keep it until spring. I will bring it back clean. Bring it back used." Then he walked toward the road, boots breaking the thin crust of snow, leaving deep deliberate prints beneath the walnut trees. That night, the Tollhouse listened to sleet without surrendering it. Miriam lay near the hearth and heard weather strike above her, travelled downward, and pass off the edge as it was meant to do. The sound was ordinary. That made it beautiful enough. By January, the chimney had become the next hard truth. The first fires had been small and watched, but winter pressed more heavily after New Year's, and a woman could not live forever beside a handful of twigs pretending to be heat. The chimney drew, yet it drew unevenly. Some mornings smoke hesitated in the throat, lower itself in the room with the sour patience of an unwelcome visitor. On windy nights, cold air dropped down the flue and scattered ash across the hearth. Outside, the trouble showed itself plainly. 3 upper bricks had spalled so badly their faces had fallen away in flakes, leaving soft orange cores. Mortar powdered under her thumb. The crown had cracked near the south edge, and water had entered there long enough to freeze, widen, thaw, and freeze again through many seasons. The chimney was standing because habit sometimes outlasts strength. Miriam carried a broken brick to Kina's. Arthur set it on the counter, scratched the surface with his thumbnail, and frowned. "Too soft for the weather now. What do I use for that stack?" "Hydraulic lime, sand, and a little fireclay near the flue. Do not patch old brick with hard Portland unless you want the brick to lose the argument. Mortar should give before the masonry does." He measured the proportions on the back of a receipt: 2 parts clean sand, 1 part hydraulic lime for exterior joint, and for firebox and inner throat. 3 parts sand, 1 part fireclay, 1 part lime. Mix damp enough to hold shape but not shine. He sold her a smock of hydraulic lime, a small sack of fireclay, and pointed her toward a pile of salvaged brick behind the store. "Pick the ones that ring," he said. She tapped each brick with the handle of the roofing hatchet. Some answered dull and were left behind. Some gave a clearer note and went into a crate. The salvaged ones did not match in colour, but they had endured 1 life already and might endure another if placed correctly. For 3 weeks, chimney work ruled the day. The temperature stayed mostly in the 20s, with a few mornings lower, when the bucket water froze in a skin thick enough to lift with 2 fingers. Mortar behaved badly in such cold. Arthur warned her to work only when the sun touched the wool, to keep the materials covered, to warm the sand indoors near the hearth, and never to lay mortar onto frozen brick. She followed every instruction because there was no money for pride. She began the bad joints. Using the cold chisel and a narrow screwdriver Arthur had filed into joint tools, she removed powdered mortar from between the bricks to a depth of nearly 3/4 of an inch where the wall allowed. Dust fell into her sleeves. Chips struck her cheek. She brushed each joint clean with the wire brush, then with a dry paintbrush from the house inventory. Too ruined for art, but still fit to remove grit. Every 15 minutes. Her fingers went numb. She learned the cycle. Work till the chisel felt distant in her hand. Climb down. Press fingers under arms. Breathe without wasting breath on complaint. Flex hand until pain returned, because pain meant the hand had not yet left her. Climb again. Repeat. On the worst days. She worked from a plank set between 2 ladders, no higher than she could fall from and still hope to stand. Rupp came twice without being asked. He checked the plank, narrowed his eyes at her joint depth, and nodded once. Then he left. That was his version of encouragement. Mixing mortar required patience of a different kind. She measured sand in the dented bucket, lime in the cracked enamel cup, fireclay by the half cup when needed. Dry ingredients first. Turned together until no streaks remained. Water added slowly. Never dumped. Too wet and the mortar smeared. Too dry and it would not key into the joint. The right mixture clung to the trowel, held a ridge, and broke clean when pressed. She dampened the old brick before filling the joint so it would not steal water too quickly from the new mortar. Then she packed each joint in layers with the narrow tool, pressing hard enough that her wrist ached. Strike. Fill. Press. Scrape. Strike. Fill. Press. Scrape. No gap open for wind to enter and pry. The inner firebox received gentler work. The cracked firebrick near the back had to be eased loose. Not shattered. She chipped away the old bedding mortar, cleaned the cavity, buttered the replacement brick with fireclay mix, and pressed it in until its face sat flush. Stove cement sealed a narrow seam near the throat where smoke might otherwise have found a dishonest path into the wall. By late January, the chimney no longer shed powder at a touch. It was not handsome. The salvaged bricks made a patchwork near the top, red beside orange beside dark brown. But the were filled. The crack crown had been sloped with a lime-rich cap that would carry water outward. Inside, the throat had been scraped and sealed where it most needed sealing. The hearthstones had been lifted, cleaned beneath, and reset in a bed of sand and ash because one had rocked underfoot. The test fire on January 29. She chose a cold clear evening with little wind. The room had been swept. A bucket of water stood within reach. The poker, spoon, and a square of damp burlap lay beside the hearth. She opened the door slightly to give the fire air, then lit a twist of paper and held it high in the throat to warm the flue. Smoke rose immediately. Kindling first, then 2 pieces of wrist-thick maple, then one split oak no wider than her forearm. She watched the smoke. It climbed. No hesitation. No belly of grey rolling back in the room. She went outside with her coat unbuttoned and looked up. From the repaired chimney, smoke rose clean and narrow into the winter dust. Not brack. Not forced sideways. Not leaking through the brick. Clean. She stood in the yard until her face stung from cold. The Tollhouse, seen from the old road, had begun to send a sign into the evening that could be understood from a distance. Someone was inside. Someone had made heat. Someone tended to remain. When she returned, the front room held warmth deeper than before. The stones near the hearth accepted it and gave it back slowly. She set beans to simmer in the enamel cup and sat on the floor with her hands open to the fire, palm-lined with mortar cuts, knuckles cracked, wrists marked by lime. The house did not thank her. It did something better. It held. The floors had weighed beneath every task. They had taken soot, snow melt, brick dust, roof grit, ash, spilled creek water, and the daily punishment of Miriam's careful boot. In the beginning, she had asked only that they not fail under her. By the end of January, after the roof shed water and the chimney drew clean, she could ask more. Not beauty. Not yet. Soundness. The front room floor was white pine. Old growth. Wider than boards sold in ordinary lumber yards now. Some planks measured nearly 14 inches across, their surfaces darkened by iron. Smoke, boots, and time. Hand-cut rows, head nails held them down where they still held. The nail heads irregular and beautiful in the way useful things become beautiful after long service. In several places, boards had lifted at the edges or cupped toward the centre. One near the door had split along the grain for nearly 3 feet. Arthur inspected it on a Tuesday, kneeling with difficulty while Miriam held the lantern. "You do not replace these unless they are gone through," he said. "Pine like this does not grow twice for people who waste it." He showed her how to set loose nails without bruising the wood. A nail set made from a filed punt. One careful hammer. No broad strikes. The rows head-nail that could be saved were saved. The ones too rusted to trust were removed slowly with a cat's paw cushioned by a scrap of leather. For replacements. Arthur sold her old cut nails from a coffee tin behind the counter. 8 cents for careful handful. She patched only where rot had made refusal necessary. A short section near came up in pieces, damp and punky beneath the surface. Under it, the joist was sound after drying, though stained. She cut a patch from salvaged pine rup found in the loft of a dismantled shed, planing the underside until it sat level with the old boards. It did not match exactly. That was honest. A repair pretending never to have happened was a kind of vanity. For sanding, she rented a random orbit sander from a man in Carlisle for $14 a day, a sum large enough to make her write it twice in the ledger before agreeing. The machine came a metal case with a cord repaired in 2 places with brack tape. The man showed her how to change the discs and warned her not to tip it. "Let float," he said. "You force it. It bites." She carried it back on the bus and then on foot, resting every half-mile because the case dragged her shoulder down. Snow along the roadside had hardened into grey ridges. Passing cars sent wind against her skirt. By the time she reached the Tollhouse, her arms trembled from the weight, but the daylight remained, and rental time was a meter running whether one was tired or not. She began with 80 grit. The sound filled the room and shook dust from every ledge. The sander moved in small circles under her hands, impatient but controllable if she kept her elbows loose. At first, the old surface resisted. Then, slowly, the blackened top layer opened to brown beneath. She worked board by board, never lingering too long in one place, moving with the grain even though the machine spun otherwise. Dust rose in pale clouds. She tied cloth to her nose and paused often to sweep. because dust hid mistakes. The first pass removed grime and high splinters. The second pass, with 120 grit, softened the transitions. Old boot scars remained. So did nail marks. Dark crescents near the counter. A burn mark by the hearth. And a long shallow groove where some earlier table had been dragged again and again across the same path. Miriam left them. The aim was not to erase the life of the floor. The aim was to make it clean enough to continue bearing feet. The final pass with 220 grit changed the sound under her shoes. The boards no longer rasped. Her palm could move over them without catching. In the late light, the pine showed colours she had not expected, dark honey where the grain widened, amber near the hearth, and in old press places a tone close to mahogany, deep and reddish, as if the years had entered the wood and settled there. She returned the sander the next morning, too tired to speak beyond the required words. The man inspected it, found no damage, and gave back the small deposit Arthur had insisted she leave so the transaction would have dignity on both sides. Finishing the floor took longer. Arthur advised a mixture he trusted more than varnish. First coat tin tongue oil worked in by hand, second coat of linseed oil and turpentine, third coat mostly oil. Each coat wiped clean after it had time to drink. No puddles. No hurry. 48 hours cure between coats, if the weather stayed dry enough. Longer if damp returned. The first coat disappeared almost as soon as she spread it. The wood drank greedily, darkening along grain lines, revealing patterns hidden beneath years of soot. Miriam worked on her knees with a rag wrapped around her palm. Press an oil in the boards in long strokes. The smell was nutty, sharp, and faintly medicinal. It entered her sleeves, her hair, the room itself. She opened the door despite the cold to keep the air moving. The second coat gave depth. The third gave a low sheen, not glossy, only visible when light crossed from the cashier's window at an angle. The floor looked less repaired than fed. It had taken what it needed and kept its scars. On one morning, between the second and third coats, Miriam did not work. The day had begun badly before sunrise. A pan she had trusted beneath the roof edge had overflowed from melting frost. A mouse had chewed the corner of the cornmeal paper. Her hands hurt before she used them. The ledger showed more spent than she wished to see. When she tried to relight the hearth, the match broke. She sat back on her heels and stayed there, looking at the unlit kindling until the room blurred with exhaustion rather than smoke. There was no speech for that kind of morning. She put on her coat and walked without tools toward the marshy low ground beyond the creek, where winter reeds stood tan and brittle along a shallow pool. The air was raw, but the sky had cleared. She sat on a flat stone with her hands tucked into her sleeves and watched a great blue heron standing at the far edge of the water. The bird did not hurry. It lifted one leg, held it, placed it down without disturbing the surface. Its body seemed made of grey weather and waiting. For a long time, it did nothing a careless eye would name as action. Yet it was entirely alive, entirely attentive, wholly occupied with being where it was. Miriam watched until the cold reached through her coat. She did not paint. She did not sand. She did not measure. She did not earn the day in any visible fashion. Near noon, the heron opened its wings and crossed the marsh with 3 strokes, leaving the water empty but not wasted. When Miriam returned, the Tollhouse stood exactly as she left it. The work had waited. So had she. By February, the windows had become less a repair than a negotiation with weather. There were 8 in all, counting the cashier's window, 2 in the front room facing the old turnpike, 1 narrow side window near the hearth, 2 in the back room, 1 small square opening beside the rear door, 1 attic gable window beneath the roof peak, and barred toll opening itself. 3 had no glass at all. 4 held cracked panes that trembled in wind. 1, in the narrow side wall, had a pane so wavy and flawed that Arthur believed it might be original to an earlier structure, perhaps reused when the Tollhouse was altered. Its lower corner bore a tiny bubble trapped in the glass like a held breath. "Do not replace that one," he said. It leaked, then make it leak less. The old pane became a lesson in restraint. Miriam began with the missing glass because holes were simpler than reverence. Arthur measured the sashes and cut replacement panes from salvaged glass taken out of a schoolhouse renovation, each piece wrapped in newspaper and marked in pencil. He sold her a can of DAP 33 glazing putty and warned her that putty was not bread dough, no matter how much it might tempt a hungry hand to overwork it. Warm it in your palm. Roll it once. Press it clean. Tool it at an angle. Leave the line neat or water will teach you manners. She removed old glazing with a putty knife heated near the fire. Not enough to scorch the wood. Just enough to soften what time had hardened. Broken points came out with needle nose pliers. Old paint flaked from the rabbits in grey-green curls. Where bare wood showed, she brushed on a thin coat of linseed oil so the dry sash would not drink oil from the new putty too quickly. Glass frightened her more than nails. It broke without warning if pressed wrong. It cut even when lying still. She handled each pane with cloth wrapped around both hands, setting it into the sash as if laying a sleeping child into narrow bed. Glazier's points held it, one each side, pressed flat with the putty knife. Then came the putty, tummed into place, smoothed, and told into bevel that would lead rain outward. The first window looked clumsy. The bevel wavered. One corner held too much putty, another too little. She scraped it off and began again because Arthur's voice had entered her judgment. Leave the line neat. Water will teach you manners. By the third pane, her hand learned the pressure. The cracked windows require decisions. Not every crack deserved replacement. A short crack near the upper corner could be stabilized until spring. A long diagonal running from rail to stile had to go. One pane in the back room had broken years ago and been patched with cardboard, tin, and a page from a seed catalogue. Behind it, she found a nest of dead flies and one curled snakeskin so light moved when she breathed. The attic gable window nearly defeated her because the sash had swollen shut. Rupp came by, looked at it, and handed her a wooden wedge. Persuade. Do not punish. She worked the wedge along the seam, tapping lightly, moving an inch, tapping again. Paint cracked. The sash groaned. At last it shifted upward half an inch, then 1 inch, releasing a smell of dust and summer heat stored from years before. She cleaned the track, rubbed it with candle wax, and lowered it gently. The next time it moved, it sounded less like protest. The sash cords came next. 2 low windows had broken, leaving the weights useless inside their pocket. Arthur sold her 1/4-inch cotton sash cord, not modern nylon, because cotton belonged better with the old pulleys and would not cut in them as sharply. She removed the interior stop, marking each with pencil so it would return to the same place. Then she eased out the sash, found the weight pocket, and reached into the well. The first counterweight was cold iron, pear-shaped, dusty, and heavier than expected. She tied the new cord with a figure-8 knot at the top of the weight, pulled it snug, then fed the cord over the pulley and into the sash groove. Twice she tied the cord too long, once too short. The fourth attempt held the sash balanced so it stayed where placed, neither dropping nor flying upward. That little obedience pleased her. Windows were not merely holes filled with glass. They were agreements between inside and outside. They admitted light while refusing weather. They opened when air was need and closed when cold had become too bold. A good window asked for balance, weight against weight, putty against rain, old wood against new season. The cashier's window required the most care. The iron bars remained fixed in the stone, and the lower sill was worn smooth where hands had passed coins for decades. She did not want to disturb it. Broken glass had to be removed from behind the bars with slow movements and a wrapped wrist. She fitted salvaged panes from the inside, work around the iron as if around bones. The putty line there could not be perfect. Her fingers could not reach every angle. She did the best work the old structure allowed. On the last February afternoon of window work, she returned to the narrow side pane, the one Arthur had told her not to replace. The leak came from failed putty along the lower edge and a hairline gap where the sash had shrunk away from the frame. She cleaned it with the gentlest tools, dull knife, dry brush, cloths. The glass distort everything seen through it. Walnut branches bend strange curves. The road seemed to lift where it should fall. Her own reflection peered older, then younger. Depend on where she stood. She pressed new putty around the pane and told the bevel slowly. Outside, on a walnut branch near the repaired wool, a chickadee landed. It was no more than a handful of feathers. Black cap, white cheek, grey back, moving with quick, exact confidence among the bare twigs. It turned its head toward the window as if inspecting the work. Miriam held still, putty knife in hand. The bird hopped once, pecked at the bark, then looked through the wavy glass. For a moment, its body bent in the distortion, doubled and narrowed by old imperfection. Then it flew. Miriam finished the bevel and wiped the knife clean. By evening, all 8 windows had some form of defence. Not all were pretty. None were new in the way store windows were new. But the wind no longer walked through the Tollhouse as if it owned the rooms. Light entered with more order. The fire held heat longer. At night, the glass reflected the interior back to her hearth. Counter, repaired floor, stacked linen, tools laid carefully. One young woman moving through the frame of a house that had begun, slowly, to accept her labour. She stood at the cashier's window after dark and looked out at the road. The iron bars the night into narrow panels. Beyond them, the turnpike held its silence under the walnut. Inside, the last windy began its long cure, skinning over in the cold. Miriam placed the putty knife beside the repaired sash, washed her hands, and closed the ledger for the day. The plaster failed after the windows began to hold. That was the way old houses sometimes work. A person repaired one weakness, and the next one announced itself. Not out of malice, but because weather had fewer doors through which to enter. Near the chimney, 3 patches of well began to loosen in broad shallow bowls, each one sounding hollow beneath Miriam's knuckles. The largest sat above the hearth, where heat met cold stone and years of damp had worked behind the finished coat. The second ran near the back room doorway. The third, smaller but uglier, had cracked beneath the cashier's counter. She did not strike them down at once. Arthur came on a Sunday afternoon with a sack under one arm and his church coat button wrong at the middle. Heat patch with 2 fingers. Not hurried. Listening as if the wool were telling him where the harm had entered. Horsehair plaster, he said. Original where it has not been fooled with. Behind the broken edge, Miriam could see hand-split oak lath. Each strip irregular, held by old nails blackened with age. Between the lath, the first coat had squeezed through in rough keys, some still holding, some broken away like teeth. The hair within the plaster showed in fine dark strands, binding lime and sand together after so many decades that touching it felt almost impolite. Arthur opened the sack he had brought. Found this in the loft above the store. My father bought horsehair in the 50s for a church repair and never used half. Mice did not get it. You can mix it in. Miriam took the bag. It was lithe than expected and smelled faintly of dust. Animal. And dry thyme. The recipe went in the ledger before the first trowel moved. Lime putty and sand for the base. A handful of chopped horsehair mixed through until the strands distributed evenly and did not clump. For the scratch coat. Coarse and firm. Pressed hard through the lath and scored before it set. For the brown coat. 3/8 of an inch. Levelled but not polished. Left 72 hours before the finish. For the finished coat. 1/8 of an inch. Lime rich. Trolled smooth with water ficked sparingly from the fingers. She removed only what had failed. That was harder than clearing everything. Ruin invites sweeping gestures. Repair asks for judgment. She used the putty knife first, then the narrow chisel, cutting back loose edges until the remaining plaster held firmly under pressure. Dust fell over the hearth. Little stones struck the floor. Behind the failed places. The oak lath appeared dark but sound after brushing. She vacuumed nothing because there was no vacuum. She swept, brushed, blew dust carefully from the keys, and dampened the old work so the new plaster would not dry too quickly against it. The scratch coat was rough work. She pressed the plaster through the lath until it bulged behind, forming new keys to grip the wool from within. Horsehair caught against the trowel and pulled if she rushed. She learned to load, press, lift, and move sideways. Load, press, lift. When the surface had firm but not hardened, she scored it with a scrap of lath in diagonal lines so the brown coat would have something to hold. The brown coat taught patience. 3/8 of an inch looked thin in the manual and thick on the wool. Too much sagged. Too little left hollows. She worked from the bottom upward near the chimney, feathering the edges into older plaster without pretending they were the same. The new patches dried lighter at first, then settled toward the wool's age colour as moisture left. For 3 days she kept the room from freezing too hard, feeding the fire modestly, never allowing fierce heat to crack what had just been mended. These patches will hold another 100 years. The sentence came to her while she was smoothing the final coat, not as pride, but as a standard. She said it once under her breath and then made her hand worthy of it. The finished coat went on like cream over stone. She used the broadest knife Arthur owned and polished with slow strokes, each pass removing more than added. The plaster shone briefly while wet, then dulled as it began to set. By evening, the 3 patches were visible but calm, pale islands in an aged wool, each edge sound, each surface ready to accept limb wash when spring brought steadier warmth. That night, the firelight crossed the repaired plaster and did not find gap. Doris from the lunchroom began leaving paper bags on the doorstep before Miriam ever saw her dough it. The first bag appeared on a February morning after sleep. It sat just inside the post, folded twice at the top, with no note and no claim attached, were 2 biscuits in wax paper, a jar of ham and beans soup, 3 bruised apples, and a heel of pie whose crust had broken along one side. Miriam carried the bag inside and stood over it for a while, as if food could be a mistake. The second bag arrived 3 days later. This one held coffee grounds tied in cloth, pea soup thick enough to hold a spoon upright, and 6 slices of bread already buttered. Miriam walked to town that afternoon, entered Cora's lunchroom, and recognized the same wax paper behind the counter. The woman at the stove was broad-hipped, red-cheeked from heat, with hairpin by the neck and forearms dusted in flour. Her name tag said Doris, though the lettering had nearly worn off. "I need to pay for the food," Miriam said. Doris did not look up from scraping a griddle. "Food? The bag. Could be anybody leaving bags. It is your wax paper." Doris turned then, holding the scraper in one hand. Her eyes were blue and sharp enough to cut through politeness, but not unkind. "You opening that toll place?" "I am repairing it." "Same thing. If you ask the building." "I cannot take charity." "Then do not." Miriam placed coins on the counter. Doris looked at them, then pushed them back with the scraper's flat end. "You can pay me in candles when the shop reopens." "It is not a shop." "Not yet." The words were not grand. Doris returned to the griddle before Miriam could answer, turning bacon with the careful irritation of a woman determined not to be thanked. After that, the bags continued. Not every day, not so often as to corner Miriam in dependence. Soup when the weather turned bitter. Bread on Mondays. Once, a paper packet of salt and pepper folded into napkin. Another time, half a roast chicken carcass with enough meat left on the bones to flavour beans for 3 meals. Doris never asked what Miriam had eaten. She knew. Caleb arrived by bicycle in late February, riding a red Schwinn with one bent fender and a playing card clicking against the rear spokes. He was 14 or 15, tall in the unfinished way of boys who have not yet learned the dimensions of their own arms. His hair fell over his forehead, and he wore a canvas jacket too light for the weather. Across his handlebars lay a splitting maul, tied with baling twine. He stopped near the walnut tree, put one foot down, and looked at the woodpile Miriam had been slowly building from fallen branches and deadfall. "You need that split smaller," he said. Miriam was scraping lime from a bucket. My mother said I should help. I cannot pay you." He shrugged. By the barrister directness of money. "She said you'd say that." "Who is your Mrs. Brindle?" That stopped her. Caleb untied the maul and walked to the pile without waiting for permission. He set a round of maple upright on the chopping block Rupp had dragged near the back door. His first swing was too hard and badly aimed, glancing off one side. He reddened, reset the wood, and swung again. This time the maul split the round cleanly. He tried not to look pleased. For 2 hours he worked. Miriam stacked what he split, sorting kindling, wrist-thick pieces, and larger chunks for longer fires. Caleb spoke little at first. Boys often believed silence made them seem older. After a while, he told her he liked mechanical drawing, hated Latin, and could fix bicycle chains with his eyes almost closed. He had never known the Tollhouse except as a place adults warned children away from, which meant every child had visited at least once. When she offered him 2 quarters before he left, he stepped back. You worked. My mother said. About your grandfather. My grandfather. He looked down, dragging one boot through chips. Or somebody. She said your people did work that was worth remembering. He tied the mole back to the Schwinn and rode away before the sentence had to settle between them. The playing card clicked down the old road until the sound vanished under the walnuts. Reverend Boyd came without food, tools, or advice. He walked past the Tollhouse every morning at nearly the same hour. A lean elder man in a brack coat gone green at the seams, with a hat he lifted whenever he saw Miriam outside. His church stood 2 miles toward town. White clapboard, modest steeple, bell that rang with a slight crack in its tone. He did not enter the yard unless asked. He did not commend on the roof, the chimney, the windows, or the fact that a young woman lived alone in a building respectable people had left to rot. The first week, he only tipped his hat. The second week, when Miriam was carrying creek water in 2 buckets that knocked against her knees, he stopped near the road. Peace over this house. 4 words. Then he continued walking. He said the same thing the next morning, and the next, always from the road, never loud enough to make display of it. Some days she answered with a nod. Some days her hands were too full and she answered by not looking away. Once, during a hard wind, he paused to place 3 fallen branches in a neater pile near the gate, then walked on as if the branches had arranged them. In town, people no doubt spoke. They could hardly avoid it. A condemned toll house. A young woman alone. Smoke rising from a chimney that had been dead for years. Such things entered conversation the way cold entered crack. But Doris kept feeding. Caleb kept splitting when school and chores allowed. Reverend Boyd kept passing with his hat lifted. And Arthur kept the account. A life was being held by more hands than Miriam could see at once. She postponed the sell until February 1 month. The date mattered only because she had written it in the ledger 3 times and crossed it out twice before. There were always reasons to delay. The roof, the chimney, the windows, the wall, the fact that cellars were dark and often honest in unpleasant ways. Damp could live there. Snakes could winter there. Rot could explain itself from below. A person who wished to remain hopeful might avoid looking under the house. But hope that refused inspection was only fear dressed neatly. The cellar door lay in the back room beneath a trap of 2 wide boards with an iron ring set into one end. The ring had rusted nearly black. Miriam swept around it, cleared grit from the seam with the point of the putty knife, and lifted. Nothing happened. She tried again with both hands. The boards gave a reluctant crack, then rose all at once, releasing air so cold and mineral it seemed untouched by the fire-lit room above. She set the door back against the wall and held the lantern over the opening. 7 granite steps descended in darkness. They were narrow and worn slightly at the centre, each one damp along the back edge. The side walls were fieldstone, dry laid in places and mortared in others, with roots thread between 2 stones near the top like thin brown fingers. She waited for movement below. No sound came except the slow fall of water somewhere far back. She took the lantern, the roofing hatchet, and a length of rope tied around her waist and fastened above to the table frame, though she knew well enough the table would not save her from foolishness. It was a gesture toward caution. Some gestures mattered. The cellar measured 12 feet by 15, close and low, with a fieldstone floor uneven underfoot. The air smelled of limestone, damp earth, old potatoes, and mouse dust. Against one wall stood shelves made from rough boards, mostly empty except for 2 broken jars, a clay pipe stem, and a nest of walnut shells. Near the far corner sat the remains of a coal bin. A rusted shovel leaned beside it, its handle split but still attached. The foundation stones above showed no fresh collapse. That was something. At the centre of the cellar floor lay a single dressed granite slab. It did not belong with the rough field stone around it. The slab was rectangular, perhaps 3 feet by 4. Its surface smooth than the rest of the floor and set with deliberate care. On one corner, partly darkened by damp, someone had carved a Kraftmarker 6 pitel rosette inside a circle, the same family of shape as the hex sign scratched in the tin canister, though plainer, more workmanlike. Miriam knelt and touched the carved lines. The stone was too heavy to move. More importantly, it did not ask to be moved yet. She marked it in the ledger, sent to granite slab with rosette. Not lifted. Then she underlined not lifted twice. The house had already taught her that discovery without readiness could become damage. Some things were allowed to remain closed until the right question had been earned. She inspected the walls, the coal bin, the shelves, and the stair-stringers. On the way back up, her shoulder brushed the underside of the 3rd step, and something shifted. A small sound. Wood against stone. She froze. 1 foot on the 4th step. Lantern held dough. Beneath the 3rd step, wedged between the granite support and the stairboard, sat a small oak box darkened by dust. It had been pushed far enough back that a person descending would not see it unless the lantern angled upward. Miriam touched it first with the hatchet handle. It did not move. She worked it loose with her fingers, easing one side, then the other, until it came free into her hands. The box had no lock, only lid swollen by time. Upstairs, near the hearth, she brushed it clean before opening. The lid resisted, then slid a dry wooden whisper. Inside lay brass key and a tin-tip photograph. The key was tarnished dark in the grooves, but bright along one edge where it had rubbed against the box. Its bow was shaped not in a plain circle, but in a 6 pitel form, like the rosette on the slab, like the hex sign on the canister, like the old tulip, bird-heart language of hands that made meaning without shouting. Its shaft was narrow and old-fashioned, cut for no lock Miriam recognized. The tin-tip had been wrapped in cloth. She unfolded it and held it near the window. A young woman stood before the Tollhouse in summer light. The building behind her was whole, roof intact, windows glazed, sign painted, porch upright. Vines grew neatly along one side, trained rather than wild. The young woman wore a dark skirt and a light blouse with sleeves gathered at the wrist. Her hair was part in the centre and pinned back. In one hand she held a brush. In the other, a sheet of paper. Miriam's fingers tightened around the plate. The face was not hers exactly. The mouth was fuller, the chin firmer, the eyes perhaps darker. But a resemblance rose from the image with such force that the room seemed to shift around it. Not a mirror. A rhyme. On the back, writ on a paper scrap tucked in the cloth, were the words, Clara Ebersol Krause, daughter of Samuel Krause, age 25, summer of 993. Miriam read it beneath the window, then carried it to the candle, then back to the window again. Clara, daughter of Samuel, not Lydia. Then, but close enough to her hand and house to belong to the same kept line. A woman who had stood in front of this very cottage holding the trade before grief closed around it. The brush in the photograph was long and slim, a tool of the craft. Miriam set the tintype upright against the canister and placed the brass key on the mantel. She did not know what it opened. That was all right. Knowing too soon had its own dangers. The key could wait in plain sight, catching firelight in its tarnished petals. The granite slab could wait below. The photograph could remain where the room could see it. Not every secret needed to be chased the day it breathed. Still, that night, when the fire lowered and the house settled, Miriam looked at the young woman's face and felt the peculiar steadiness of being neither first nor alone. Spring did not arrive as a declaration. It loosened things. At first, the snow retreated from the south side of the Tollhouse, drawing back from the stone wall in a dirty, shrinking line. Then the old road softened, its frozen ruts turning dark and damp beneath the walnut. The creak behind the house grew louder with snow melt, carrying twigs, leaves, and one pale feather that spun twice in an eddy before slipping under the roots. The air changed by degrees. It smelled less of iron cold and more of mud, bark, and something green preparing self underground. Walnut catkins peered in April, hanging like small tassels from the branches. Miriam left the door open during the warmest hour of each day. Not wide, only enough for fresh air to move through the rooms and carry our winter's long breath. The plaster cured. The window putty firmed. The floor settled into its oil. The roof held through rain. The chimney drew on damp morning. Every improvement remained modest. Everyone mattered. People in town began to speak differently, though not always to her face. The Tollhouse was no longer called Condemned with the same certainty. Arthur referred to it as your place, without pusing. Fewer bags and more scraps of useful news, who had spare jars, who had old shelving, who was clearing a shed. Caleb came one Saturday with his Schwinn and spent an hour tightening the porch rail because, he said, loose rails made him nervous. Reverend Boyd still lift his hat, though when spring warmed the road, he sometimes added a second sentence about rain or robins. Inside, the heirlooms remained wrapped. This surprised some part of Miriam that had expected discovery to become immediate use. The brushes waited in oilcloth. The pigment packs stayed labelled and dry. The linen bolts remained uncut. The letter lay in clean paper, read often but handled carefully. The tin-tip watched from the mantel beside the tarnished key. She decided not to begin the craft that spring. Not properly. The decision came after a morning of setting out the brushes and realizing her hand was not ready for them. It could mend, scrub, nail, carry, mix, scrape, and sand. It could build heat and keep accounts. But to take up those cherry handles and ask them to return immediately to beauty felt too much like asking a newly repaired roof to bear a storm before the tar had cured. She ordered materials with one coin, not from the main bundle, but from the small pouch. One barber $half would become practice paper, new gum arabic, and a lit-prepared pigment from a supplier Arthur found through a catalogue. She would keep the older pigments sealed until she knew enough not to waste them. She would practice on scraps first, as Lydia had instructed. Stems before flourishes, structure before ornament. The finest paper would wait, on warm afternoons. She sat at the counter beneath the cashier's window and copied lines with the pencil stub. Verticals, curves, tulip stems, bird backs, heart shapes restrained from becoming too red. No colour yet, only form, The old road lay beyond the iron bars, less hidden now as weeds turned green along its edges. One April evening, after rain, she carried the wrapped brushes to the counter and laid one hand lightly over them. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December, the first completed piece dried beneath a weighted board on the restored counter. Snow had fallen overnight, not heavily, just enough to white the abandoned turnpike and gather along the walnut limbs. The Tollhouse held warmth without strain now. The chimney drew in a steady column. The repaired windows shone with small wavering reflections from the fire. Along the wall above the counter, limwash had settled into soft uneven surface, not pure white, but the colour of cream held in shade. Miriam lifted the board after breakfast. Beneath it lay a birth record for Doris's first granddaughter. She had worked on it for 23 evenings, never more than her hand could honestly give. The paper had been properly sized and rested. The lettering stood firm before any ornament touched it. Around the name, tulips rose in pairs, their cups open but not showy. 2 birds faced inward from the upper corners, each one carrying a stem of blue. The heart at the bottom was a restrained red, darkened with a breath of brown, because Lydia had been right. Too much red made feeling vain. The brushwork was not perfect. Miriam could see where one vine thickened near a curve and where a bird's tail had required a correction so fine only the maker would know. But the piece held together. It breathed. It did not imitate Hannah Law. It did not imitate Lydia. It belonged to the long line because it had stopped trying to prove itself. She left it beneath light weight until afternoon, then wrapped it in tissue and carried it to town. Doris took it in the kitchen doorway, flour on both wrists, steam rising behind her from a pot of chicken soup. She unwrapped only one corner at first, then the whole page. For a woman who had spent much of her life refusing sentiment by keeping busy, Doris became very still. "She'll have this when she's grown," she said. "Yes." Doris nodded, folded the tissue back over it, and looked toward the shelves as if searching for a safe place in a room full of heat and knives. "That paid for a few biscuits," she said. "Not all." No, not all. The restored interior had not become polished. It had become kept. The front room held a work counter beneath the cashier's window, built from salvaged boards planed smooth and oiled by hand. Shelves lined the well where broken plaster had once hung loose, holding jars of pigment, folded linen, brushes wrapped in cotton, paperweights made from river stones, and the ledger in which every expense, payment, and gift had been recorded. The floor, dark honey and mahogany in winter light, showed its scars with apology. Near the hearth 2 chairs, neither matching, both sturdy. The back room held a narrow bed, a washstand, a cupboard with repaired doors, and hooks for coats and aprons. No object was extravagant. Each had earned its place. The old cashier's window remained barred. Miriam never removed the iron. It belonged to the house's first purpose. Travellers had once stopped there to pay passage. Now neighbours left notes, orders, empty jars, and sometimes eggs wrapped in newspaper on the sill. In summer, children liked to stand outside and speak through the bars as if buying a ticket into another century. Miriam let them, so long as their hands were clean and their feet stayed off the stone ledge. The brass key remained on the mantel for nearly 2 years before it found its lock. It happened on a cold morning after the first completed winter orders had been wrapped and stacked for delivery. Caleb, older now and broader through the shoulders, had come to help bring in wood. He was the one who noticed the brass plate in the walnut trunk, though Miriam had walked past it countless times. Not the cast-iron company plate by the door. This one was in the old walnut west of the house, the same tree that had grown around the horseshoe marker. The bark had swelled over it until only a crescent of tarnished metal showed near the seam where the trunk had healed. Winter made such hidden things easier to see. Leaves were gone. Shadows tinned. The tree gave up a glint when sun struck low from the ridge. Caleb touched it with a gloved finger. "Is that yours?" Miriam came closer. The metal lay almost flush with the bark, oval-shaped, fixed to what seemed at first a natural fold in the trunk. She cleared moss away with the back of a knife. A tiny keyhole appeared at the lower edge, green with age but open. The brass key from mantel fit. Not smoothly. Nothing that had waited so long moved smoothly. She worked it with graphite from a pencil, turning pressure into patience. The lock clicked so softly Caleb leaned nearer to hear whether it had happened at all. A narrow door, disguised by bark and fitted into hollow carefully cut generations before, opened inward. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth blackened by time, lay a folded flag and a note. The flag had 48 stars. It was small, perhaps made for a window or a coffin top, though not large enough for official ceremony. Its stripes had darkened toward rust and cream. The blue canton had faded but held. Miriam unfolded only enough to confirm its form, then stopped. Cloth kept in darkness deserved caution before daylight claimed it. The note was dated November 1, 99N8. The handwriting was Lydia's, but rougher than the letter in the canister, as if written nearer to the wound. For Daniel, who did not come home from the war that was said to end today. Let this flag remain with his father once hung a lantern for travellers. If no grave receives his bones, let this tree hold witness. If one of ours finds it, carry his name somewhere prayers are spoken aloud. Caleb removed his cap without seeming to notice he had done it. Miriam stood with the flag in her hands and looked at the walnut tree, at the horseshoe marker, at the old road, at the Tollhouse chimney send a thin line of smoke in the winter air. History, she had learned, did not always live in books or monuments. Sometimes it waited in a tree, behind a brass plate, under bark that had taken a century to close around it. She did not display the flag in the shop. She wrapped it again in fresh acid, free paper ordered through the same catalogue that brought her pigments, then placed it in a shallow box she made from cedar offcuts. The note she copied by hand and kept the original beside the letter. Daniel's medal, the bronze one date 988, went with her the following Memorial Day to Westminster Cemetery in Carlisle, where Arthur had helped her find the Cross family plot and a marker that named Samuel but not the son buried overseas. The date was May 30, Old Decoration Day. Miriam brought no speech, only the medal, the copied note, and a small fractured bearing Daniel's name, birth year, death year, and a single bluebird facey. Reverend Boyd came, not in ceremony, but because he had heard from Arthur and understood when silence needed company. Doris sent flour from her yard in a mason jar. Caleb stood at the back with his hands folded, awkward and sincere. They did not bury the medal. They placed it for an hour against the stone, read the name aloud, and took it home before weather could steal what had already survived too much. Some honours were not meant to be left where rain and strangers could carry them away. Some were meant to be returned to the house that had kept them. The money lasted because Miriam treated it as instruction rather than rescue. Only 3 coins and 2 old bills were ever spent from the cash in the first years. 1 barber $half for practice materials. 1 Indian head cent, traded with Arthur's reluctant help to a collector for enough modern money to buy proper paper. 1 silver dollar, after long hesitation, to repair the hand pump once the well tested clean. The 2 bills went toward roof work beyond the emergency patch when spring allowed the north slope to be made sounder. The rest remained sealed. Not behind the brick again, but in the tin canister, inside a locked wooden drawer beneath the work counter. Around it, Miriam wrapped Lydia's linen strip bearing the words for keeping the house in honest repair. She added her own account sheets, each one dated, each expenditure named. On the outside of the packet, she wrote for the next one. Arthur saw the words once when helping repair the drawer slide. He read them, looked away, and said only, "Good." The shop reopened with a sign at first. Doris made that happen, as she had made many things happen, by refusing to call attention to her own hand. One morning in late spring, an index card appeared on the corkboard near the lunchroom register. Hand-lettered family records, births, marriages, house blessings. West Tollhouse, orders taken by Mail at window. The card had no flourish, only plain block letters in Dorsey's practical hand. Beside it hung notices for a lost dog, a church supper, a used washing machine, and piano lessons from a woman who came to town on Thursdays. For 3 days. No one mentioned it. Then a farmer's wife asked whether Miriam could make a marriage record for her parents' 50th anniversary. Then Mrs. Brindle ordered a copy of her mother's old birth record because the original had brown near the edges. Then Reverend Boyd asked for a house blessing for a couple who had rebuilt after a barn fire. By the second autumn, the mailing list held 43 names. Miriam kept them in a cigar box alphabetized by folded slips. Brindle, Corman, Dietz, Ebersole, Fetter, Keener, Lapp, Rupp, Weaver, and many more. Some orders came with money. Some came with produce. Some came with careful letters explaining a family name, a date uncertain by 1 year, a baby lost, a son returned, a farm sold, a grandpa who still spoke German when tired. Miriam answered each with the same respect, whether the payment was dollars, apples, mending help, or a promise made good after harvest. No newspaper wrote about her. No committee gave a plaque. The county did not apologize for nearly demolishing the building. It simply stopped mentioning the order in the records. The Tollhouse remained a minor parcel transferred for almost nothing, its assessed value low, its importance invisible to the forms designed to measure importance. That suited Miriam. Recognition had not repaired the roof. Attention had not cleaned the chimney. Fame would not mix pigment, stretch paper, or make a winter road passable. Work did not become truer when watched by many people. Often, it became true when carried quietly from morning to evening by those willing to return after failure. Caleb returned one Saturday in October with something wrapped in a feed sack. He was nearly grown by then, his Schwinn replaced by a battered pickup that smoked on hills. He had taken work after school with a cabinet maker near Carlisle and had begun learning the difference between cutting wood and listening to it. When he entered the front room, he seemed too large for the space where he had once stood holding a splitting maul with boyish embarrassment. "I made something," he said. Miriam cleared the counter. He unwrapped the feed sack. Inside lay a wooden sign, hand-carved from walnut, the letters raised and clean, the background smooth but not over-sanded. It read, Krause and Daughters, Fracture and Hand Lettering, Old Turnpike Tollhouse. Miriam did not stick for several seconds. Caleb shifted his weight. The plural is for later, he said. Or before. I was not sure. The sign's carved border of small tulips and stars. Not perfect, but made with care. At the lower right, almost hidden in the vinework, he carved a tiny bicycle wheel. She saw it and let it remain unmentioned because some signatures were braver when not dragged into speech. I cannot pay what this took, she said. He looked offended in the exact way his mother would have. You gave my mother that record. She paid. She cried after you. Miriam touched the raised letters with 2 fingers. Krause and Daughters. Not because she had daughters. Not because Clara or Lydia or Hannelore had all stood here in one unbroken line. The truth was less tidy and more generous. Daughters could mean those who carried forward what women before them had kept alive under harder conditions than praise. Daughters could include the living, the gone, the found, the chosen, the not yet born. They hung the sign beneath the old toll fragment before sunset. Rupp, who had arrived supposedly to return a borrowed plane iron, held the ladder. Arthur came with proper screws because he distrusted nails in public signage. Doris brought coffee in a thermos and said the lettering was too fine for people who drove fast, which meant she approved. Mrs. Brindle stood back with her arms crossed and inspected the alignment. Left side up 1/8, she said. Caleb groaned, but moved it when it finally hung true. The old building carried both names at once, the nearly vanished toll sign above, the new carved walnut below. Past and present did not merge. They kept their own grain, but they faced the road together. That winter, Miriam began writing her own letter. She did not wait till sickness or age required it. Lydia had written at the edge of death, and the urgency of that letter had preserved what grief nearly buried. Miriam wanted to write before urgency sharpened her hand too much. She began with scrap paper, because all proper work began with scraps. My dear one, whoever you are. She stopped after the first line. The words belonged to Lydia, and yet had become large enough to shelter another voice. Miriam copied them again on better paper, then set the page aside. For several evenings, she wrote notes rather than sentences. How to test the well after a flood, which roof seam needed inspection every autumn, where the ledger was kept, which drawer held the canister, how much of the cash remained, which pigments were original and should not be used except by someone who understood them. The meaning of the granite slab in the cellar remained unwritten because she still did not know it, and because a future hand deserved at least one unopened question. She wrote about people too. Doris, who accepted payment in candles and then forgot to count them. Arthur, who made a count into form of guardianship. Rupp, who taught that straight nails mattered because hidden work mattered. Mrs. Brindle, who knew law could be a fence around the vulnerable if held firmly enough. Caleb, who carved plural daughters into walnut because he understood inheritance better than he knew. Reverend Boyd, whose 4 words had crossed the property line each morning without demanding entry. The letter grew slowly. It did not try to sound wise. Wisdom that announced itself too early comes decoration. She wrote plainly, with ink ground from walnut hulls gathered beneath a tree that had held Daniel's flag. The colour dried warm brown. At the top of the page, She painted 2 modest birds face opposite directions, one toward the old road and one toward the door. Near the close, she wrote the sentence that had followed her from ruin into keeping. Some roads are not abandoned, only waiting for right hands to find them. She read aloud once side the Tollhouse and once outside beneath the walnut tree. The words did not feel like an answer. They felt like a tool, useful only if handled with care. The Tollhouse waits. It has always waited. It waited when traveller counted coins under rain and lantern smoke. It waited when Lydia sealed her brushes because grief had made beauty unbearable. It waited when the turnpike emptied, when boys threw stones, when county files marked it condemned, when snow entered through the roof and mice nested in the cupboard. It waited through silence, not because buildings hope as people hope, but because matter itself can remain available to care. Stone waits. Wood waits. Roads wait. One evening, years after the first night on the floor, Mrs. Brindle opened the top right drawer of her courthouse desk to retrieve a stamp pad and found an old dollar bill beneath a stack of carbon forms. She had placed it there the day the deed was signed, separate from the county cash, meaning to move it properly before close of business. Then the phone had rung. A surveyor had argued. Snow had threatened, and ordinary work had buried the small irregularity. The bill remained folded once. She smoothed it on the desk and reckoned it by age, by memory, by the day attached to it. For a moment, sogging a wet young woman with a flour sack bag, standing before the counter as if a condemned building were not foolishness but a door. Mrs. Brindle did not spend the bill. She placed it in an envelope, wrote Tollhouse deed payment across the front, and returned it to the drawer. Some records belonged in ledgers. Others belonged where a careful hand would find them on a future day and remember that law. Mercy. And $5 had once in the same room. Outside. The square filled with evening traffic. West of Carlisle. Under the walnut trees. Smoke rose from the restored chimney. The Covstein darkened in the damp air. Behind the iron cashier's window, a lamp burned on the counter where brushes rested, clean and ready, beside a sheet of paper waiting for the first line. Tollhouse waits. It has always waited.
The Heroic Veteran Dogs is a fictional channel created to entertain, educate, and inspire the audience by exploring the deep, loyal bond between veterans and their dogs. All channel content does not represent real individuals, actual events, or documented cases. Any resemblance to real people, animals, or events is entirely coincidental.